Robb Stark stood in the great hall of Riverrun, his breath stilling as he listened to the faint rush of the tumblestone beyond the walls. The banners of House Tully swayed in the wavering torchlight, the fish of Riverrun dancing and shimmering with each errant flame. In the corridor beyond the hall, men came and went. Stark bannermen exchanging sharp glances, Tully men trying to exude reassurance they did not fully possess, and the occasional freeman called forth to assist with the day's tasks. Outside, the night was quiet but tense. He could sense their doubts, feel them in the hush of the corridors and the flicker of the torches. They all wondered, what next? He had been hailed as king in the north not long ago, after his father, Eddard Stark, had been condemned and executed in King's Landing. The river lords and the Northmen had gathered, hearts aflame with grief and anger, to declare their fealty to Robb. They had called him the Young Wolf, and they had sworn to make him king. Now, the weight of their faith lay squarely across his shoulders. He was determined to honor his father's legacy. He was determined to defend the North and the Riverlands, to avenge his father's murder, and to preserve his people from the Lannisters' wrath. But tonight, Robb was wrestling with an idea so risky that he had hardly dared speak it aloud. Though he was a boy in years, the war had taught him to think like a strategist beyond them. And so he stood, steeling himself, as he prepared to propose an alliance that would shift the tides of the realm. If King Robert Baratheon was gone, he would look to the one man who still carried the Baratheon banner as a rightful claim. For there were rumors that Stannis had declared himself the legitimate king, citing the illegitimacy of Robert's so-called heirs. Some said that Renly, too, had crowned himself. Confusion reigned in the south, and the Lannisters clung to King's Landing by forcing a child king, Joffrey, upon the Iron Throne. Joffrey might have the city, but a child with questionable parentage was hardly a rightful king. So Robb mused if he could bring the North and the crown together under a Baratheon who was truly Robert's brother. Under Stannis or Renly, whomever might better serve the cause, perhaps the realm could be freed of Lannister dominion. Perhaps Ned Stark's memory could be honored with a unity that secured peace for the North. Still, this was not a small gamble. The River Lords supported him because they believed in the king in the North. Their hearts brimmed with pride at the notion of an independent kingdom, free from the burdens of southern politics. If Robb proposed that the North and the Riverlands bow once again to a king on the Iron Throne, even if that king was a Baratheon, he would need to ensure that the terms protected the North's autonomy, that they guaranteed the safety of his people, and that his father's name was cleared and honored. He had asked his trusted counselors to meet him. They filed in slowly, each wrapped in furs or boiled leather, swords at their hips and uncertainty in their eyes. At the head of the table stood the great Jon, always looming as if he could swallow lesser men whole. Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, was there as well, his face set in a perpetual half-frown, his eyes bright with suspicion. Roose Bolton hovered at the periphery, cold and unreadable as ever, and near him stood other northern lords with quiet scowls that suggested they disliked the notion of bending the knee to any southern king. Meege Mormont, Lady of Bear Island, stood with her arms folded. She was proud and would speak her mind if she disliked what she heard. At Robb's right hand stood the newly returned Theon Greyjoy, a quiver slung across his back, though his place in Robb's circle had begun to feel uncertain. And there stood Catelyn Stark, watching her son with careful eyes that mingled sorrow, pride, and worry all at once. He cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was strong, though his stomach churned. "My lords, we have declared for the North. We have cut ties with the Iron Throne because of the injustice done to my father. We have chosen to be free, so that never again might a Stark be murdered in the capital by unscrupulous men who claim the power of the throne to cover their wrongdoing. Yet I have called you here because I believe there may be a way to achieve peace and justice that does not leave our armies fighting an endless war." He paused, giving his lords a moment to settle their murmurs. Catelyn's gaze on him felt cool, measured, and encouraging. "We all know King Robert is dead. His supposed son sits the throne, but if the rumors are true, Joffrey is not Robert's child at all. Prince Stannis has issued a claim stating Joffrey is born of incest between the queen and her brother. The city teems with rumor and doubt. Some say Lord Renly has crowned himself as well. It is chaos to the south, and that chaos benefits the Lannisters. They feed on division. Brynden Tully nodded, arms folded across his chest. I and the Lannisters hold King's Landing with gold and steel, while that golden boy sits on the throne. We fight them, or we starve them, or we do something else. But no alliance with the Baratheons has been proposed in earnest, until now. Robb straightened his back, swallowing down his nerves. I propose we reach out to the true Baratheon heir, if that is indeed Stannis by right, and discuss terms. An alliance. The North will have certain conditions. Recognition of my father's innocence, retribution for his execution, restoration of the North's right to govern itself as it once did. But we would, in turn, pledge to support a Baratheon king who has a rightful claim to the throne. We would help him rid the realm of the Lannisters' hold. Silence fell over the room. The Great John was the first to speak, voice booming, shaking the rafters. But we declared you king in the North. You want us to bend the knee again? To a Southerner? A potential ally, Robb replied evenly. An ally who might respect our ways, if we negotiate carefully and from a position of strength. We have men, we have the loyalty of the Riverlands, we have a cause that resonates across Westeros. Vengeance for the murder of Ned Stark and the cleansing of Lannister corruption. If Stannis truly stands by justice, he may agree to terms that preserve our independence within a united realm. Something akin to an alliance of equals, if such a thing is possible. But if we remain isolated in the North, the fighting will continue for years. The Lannisters will bleed us dry, or we will bleed them dry, and the realm will burn around us. We must see beyond our anger. The men's faces were stern. Lady Mormont spoke through tightened lips. And if we do not trust Stannis? He was Robert's brother, but I've never known him for mercy. He's a hard man, though just. And what of the rumors that he follows some red god from Ass-High? That he sets statues of the Seven ablaze? The Northern Lords might not care for the faith of the Seven, but I am not sure I trust a stranger's foreign god anymore. Robb could only offer a firm nod. We'd have to be cautious. That is why it's an offer only. To see what might be won for the North. If he proves untrustworthy, we lose nothing. We remain in our rightful place, declared as a free kingdom. If he shows he is willing to respect the North's autonomy, if he will ensure the safety of our people and punish the Lannisters for their crimes, then we have an ally who stands to benefit from our swords. We know little of Stannis. We only know he is relentless. If he sees the North as an asset, I believe he could be swayed. The discussion swirled back and forth, arguments rising like stormy waves. One moment, the Great John roared that it was better to remain free. Another moment, Roose Bolton's cold drawl suggested that an alliance might indeed give them a better chance at winning the war swiftly, though his motives were always veiled behind a calm mask. The Blackfish wanted to hear more of the plan. How they would approach the Baratheons, which terms they would demand, how the North's lords would maintain their dignity and honor. And standing in the midst of them all, Robb felt his heart pound at the enormity of what he was asking. But he pressed on, for the sake of the realm, for the sake of the North, for the love he bore his father's memory. Finally, his mother stepped forward. She had listened in silence, but Catelyn was never one to remain silent for long when it came to shaping the future of her children and her people. "My son," she said softly, "our family has suffered enough. If there is a chance to unite with a man who might restore justice and spare further bloodshed, we must consider it. Your father believed in doing the honorable thing, but that doesn't mean we must be naive. If you are prepared to negotiate shrewdly, to guard the North's interests, then I support you. Let us see how the Baratheons respond. It may well be Stannis. It may well be Renly, or perhaps they both will crumble and we will stand alone. But we must try." Robb offered a grateful nod. Soon, after more tense debate, the lords grudgingly agreed that a diplomatic overture to the Baratheons was not outright betrayal of the newly formed northern sovereignty. It was a step forward, a test of the Baratheons' sincerity. Thus, by the night's end, they agreed that Robb would dispatch envoys. Roose Bolton volunteered in his inscrutable way, but Robb hesitated. Instead, he chose his mother, Catelyn Stark, to lead the mission. She had been a Tully, a southern lady once, skilled in negotiations and well acquainted with the political intricacies of the Seven Kingdoms. She alone might approach a man like Stannis or Renly and speak with the courtesy and caution required. That night, as Catelyn prepared for her journey south, Robb lingered at the battlements, gazing across the dark waters that encircled Riverrun. It was the fortress where his mother had grown up, a place that had offered him safety when war erupted. Now he was sending her further south, into unknown territory. He felt torn. By forging an alliance, was he preserving his father's honor or compromising it? Was he protecting his people or endangering them? Each question gnawed at him like a wolf biting its own paw. And all the while, the ghosts of his father's memory seemed to drift around him. Ned Stark would have wanted him to fight for justice, but would he have wanted him to set aside the North's independence for that fight? Eventually, Robb turned away from the flowing waters of the Tumblestone and made his way inside. The men who recognized him along the corridors bowed or saluted, calling him Your Grace. It still felt strange to hear it, a title he never expected to bear, and one that might soon change if the alliance was accepted. But what was a crown worth if it only led to endless death and ruin? He would do what he must, just as his father had always taught him. The pack survives. Days later, Catelyn departed Riverrun accompanied by a modest retinue of northern knights, Riverland lords, and a handful of bowmen who had sworn to protect her. They traveled under the banners of House Stark and House Tully, though they also bore a white banner of truce, signifying their peaceful intentions. The journey south was tense and uneasy. Along the roads, rumors of war hovered like flies around a corpse. Soldiers from various houses roamed the countryside. Brigands found opportunity to prey upon the weak, and countless refugees sought safety wherever they could. Catelyn's party rode with caution, resting only in places deemed relatively secure. Over time, messages flew by raven. One day, a black-feathered bird arrived, carrying word that Stannis Baratheon had raised his standard at Dragonstone and declared himself the rightful king of Westeros. He demanded fealty. Another rumor stated that Renly Baratheon had marched from Highgarden with the vast might of the Reach behind him, also declaring himself king. That left Joffrey on the throne in King's Landing, the Lannisters controlling the city's defenses. The War of Five Kings had begun in earnest. And into this tumult waded Catelyn Stark, bearing Robb's message. The North desired justice for Ned Stark's murder, and if the true King Baratheon would deliver that justice, while respecting the North's autonomy, then perhaps there could be an alliance. She had no illusions about how complicated that conversation would be. Fate took her first to the camp of Renly Baratheon. Scouts informed her that Stannis was well ensconced at Dragonstone, more fortress than court, and that there was no direct route to him that did not involve a perilous sea crossing. Renly, however, was hosting an opulent gathering outside the walls of Bitterbridge, with banners fluttering in the wind. Catelyn approached under her flags of truce. She saw the luscious greens and golds of House Tyrell swirling around Renly's own golden stag on a field of green. Tents sprawled across the fields, thousands of men in shining armor. Music and laughter filled the air, the smell of roasted meat drifting from a score of cook fires. It was less like a war camp and more like a tournament ground. Yet, for all its merriment, Catelyn could see the tension simmering beneath the surface. War was in the offing, and these lords and knights would soon have to prove their mettle with steel. Renly was not difficult to approach. He welcomed Catelyn with the courtesy of a king greeting an honored guest, though she noted the somewhat too easy smile that suggested a man who believed he could charm or buy his way through any obstacle. He wore a crown of golden roses, and at his side stood his new bride, Margaery Tyrell, her beauty offset by an intelligent, watchful gaze. Also near him was Ser Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, who eyed Catelyn with open curiosity. Catelyn did not mince words. She explained that Robb Stark had been declared king in the north, that they had severed ties with the Iron Throne because of Joffrey's betrayal, but that they were willing to consider an alliance if Renly could demonstrate that his claim was just. Renly, for his part, seemed almost amused by the notion of so many kings in Westeros. He gave a gracious laugh. "My good lady, This realm is so starved for proper leadership that every region feels it must raise a king of its own. Yet, I am the king who stands for peace and prosperity. Look around." He gestured to the brightly colored tents, the smiling knights in shining armor. "The greatest houses of the Reach have rallied to me. With their swords and their harvests, I can march on King's Landing and claim what is mine by right of my blood and the realm's desire for a strong, kind king. But you say you want justice for Ned Stark's murder? Justice you shall have. Joffrey and all who aided him must be punished for that crime." Catelyn's expression remained neutral. "But will you acknowledge the North's independence? Will you let Robb reign as king in the North if he so chooses? He has pledged that if you will deliver Ned Stark's name from dishonor and see the Lannisters pay for their crimes, and if you vow to respect the North's sovereignty in all but the most crucial matters of the realm, he will lend the strength of the North to your cause. My son does not wish to rule the Iron Throne. He only wishes to protect his people and honor his father." Renly considered this with an indulgent smile. He glanced briefly at Marjorie, then at Ser Loras, as if seeking their silent counsel. "Lady Stark, your terms are not so easily granted. The king in the North, that breaks the realm, divides it. My brother's rebellion, Robert's rebellion, was fought to keep the realm united, to cast down the Mad King, not to partition Westeros into separate kingdoms. If I am to be crowned king of the Seven Kingdoms, I cannot turn around and declare that the North stands outside my domain." He waved a hand in a smooth, conciliatory gesture. "But do not think me stubborn. I can compromise. The North shall have special privileges, to govern itself as it sees fit, so long as they recognize me as king. They need not pay heavy taxes, nor host southern garrisons. I will swear before gods old and new that no Lannister or any other southern lord shall rule over the North. Let the Starks remain wardens of the North, free from interference. But the official title of king in the North cannot stand if the realm is to be truly healed. Please, my lady, convey that to your son. If he bends the knee, I promise him all the freedoms he desires. He will be my most treasured warden." Though those promises were grand, they were not enough to quell Catelyn's suspicions. She saw the look in Renly's eyes, the lightness of his manner, the easy flourish of words. Here was a man who might promise much but deliver little if it ever contradicted his ambition. She left that meeting with an uncertain heart. Renly's armies were vast, and so was his confidence, yet she wondered if his claim had true legitimacy. By right of birth, Stannis was older, and the realm's inheritance laws were clear. But the lords might prefer Renly because he was more genial, more charming. Yet what would happen if the North cast its lot with him, only for Stannis to mount a stronger claim, or for Renly to prove a vain, flamboyant king who gave little heed to the old ways of House Stark? Catelyn penned a raven to Robb, conveying Renly's position. He welcomed an alliance but would not concede the North as an independent kingdom. He would, however, grant them extensive liberties under the banner of the Iron Throne. It was, in some eyes, a reasonable compromise. But would it satisfy the proud lords who had hailed Robb as king? While waiting for Robb's reply, and for an opportunity to meet Stannis, Catelyn lingered in Renly's camp. She watched the tournaments, the feasts, the constant bustle of knights shining their armor, ladies gossiping under colorful pavilions, banners streaming in the wind. She could not deny that Renly had the look of a king in the making, surrounded by wealth and powerful allies. But the entire spectacle left her uneasy. War was not a pageant. War was bitter, bloody, and cruel. She knew that all too well from the fighting in the Riverlands. Then came the news that Stannis had moved. He had declared himself not merely king, but the sole rightful king, condemning his brother Renly's claim as treason. All the while, the Lannisters still held King's Landing, Joffrey perched on the throne behind its walls of gold and steel. Word also came that Stannis had gained a foothold on the mainland. He marched with a smaller force than Renly, but it was said he had the zeal of a man convinced the gods themselves, some strange red god, were on his side. Determined to see Stannis, Catelyn departed Renly's camp with a lighter escort, mindful that time was precious. She had no illusions that she was safe on the roads of the Stormlands, but her truce banners and her identity as the Lady Stark provided some measure of protection. Renly, for his part, let her leave without protest, convinced that when Stannis failed to woo the North, Renly would remain the obvious choice for alliance. Stannis Baratheon's camp could not have been more different from his brother's. Where Renly's host was filled with music and bright pavilions, Stannis's camp was austere. Men sharpened swords, hammered dents from armor, and marched in disciplined lines. The green fields seemed subdued, as if weighed down by the gloom that hung in the air. At the heart of the camp stood a large, plain command tent marked by the flaming heart of the Lord of Light entwined with the stag of Baratheon. Catelyn's arrival sparked interest, though the guards at the edge of the encampment treated her with respect. She was shown to Stannis almost immediately. Inside his tent, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and hot metal, as if a forge had been set up somewhere nearby. Standing near a wooden war table was Stannis himself, lean and severe, every line of his face carved by years of discontent and unrelenting duty. Beside him stood the Red Priestess, Melisandre of Ashai, her red robes flowing, her eyes alight with a strange inner fire that unsettled Catelyn. Davos Seaworth, a humble, honest-looking man, stood to one side, regarding Catelyn with polite interest. And arrayed around the table were a handful of knights bearing the sunburst of House Florent or the crossed swords of other Stormland houses who had flocked to Stannis's cause. Stannis got straight to the point. "You come on behalf of Robb Stark, who calls himself king in the north." Catelyn inclined her head. "Yes, your grace. My son has been so proclaimed by his bannermen." Stannis's jaw tightened. "There is but one king of Westeros, Lady Stark. That is me by right of blood and law. Your son is no king. If he wishes to resume his role as Warden of the North, I am prepared to offer him clemency. I know the Lannisters killed Lord Eddard, a crime that must be punished. I do not fault the boy for wanting vengeance. But in naming himself king, he has committed treason against the crown, and I cannot ignore that." Catelyn swallowed, her heart pounding. Stannis's eyes were as cold as a winter sea. "My lord, my king, if it please you, my son seeks only justice for his father's murder and the safety of his people. The men of the North crowned him in response to that injustice. We have no desire for war, but we will not bend the knee to anyone who will not honor Ned Stark's memory or protect the North from Lannister aggression." Stannis glanced to the map on the table, his fingertips pressing into the parchment. "Justice is precisely what I intend to give this realm, Lady Stark. The Lannisters have usurped the throne with their bastard boy. They must be punished. But in the end, the North is part of the Seven Kingdoms. This talk of a separate kingdom is folly. If your son will swear fealty to me, if he will help me take King's Landing, then we can speak of how the North will be governed thereafter. Perhaps you will find me more generous than my brother or the Lannisters. But never doubt this. I am the king. The lords of Westeros owe me their allegiance." He paused, and Melisandre's voice slid in, low and smooth as a serpent. "The Lord of Light has shown me visions. I see a wolf joining its strength to the rightful stag, casting down the lion. The night is dark and full of terrors, Lady Stark, but there is a path to salvation for all who bend before the flame of truth." Catelyn tried not to shiver. "My son does not seek to displace you, but to protect the North. He knows that if the Lannisters remain unchecked, they will bring more bloodshed. We are prepared to fight them, but it need not be alone. If you promise Ned Stark's name will be cleared, if you promise the Lannisters will be brought to justice, if you promise that the North shall have its own governance, we will support you. But I must be honest. The lords of the North and the Riverlands named him king. They will not yield that title without cause. To them, bending the knee is a betrayal of my husband's memory." Stannis's mouth tightened further. His voice was clipped. "Then they remain traitors. Let me be plain. I will not share my crown with your boy. If he truly seeks justice, he will find it at my side, as a loyal subject. But if he continues to call himself king, then I shall treat him as a rebel. I offer him one chance to bend the knee and be pardoned. If he spurns it, I will turn my sword north once the Lannisters are defeated. I will sweep down on Winterfell and put an end to this folly." Catelyn's heart sank at those words. She knew that Robb would never accept such terms, not after the North had so fervently declared its independence. If Renly was at least willing to discuss near-total autonomy, Stannis would not even consider the notion of a separate kingdom. To him, right was right, law was law. There was no compromise in him. Still, she pressed one more time, trying to glean some sign of flexibility. "And what if, by your grace, the North is allowed to be governed as it has been for centuries, with the Starks as its liege lords, subject to no interference from the Iron Throne?" Stannis's eyes flickered. Governed, yes, but not as kings. The Starks would remain vassals of the crown. She inclined her head in acknowledgement. "I understand. I will bear your words to my son. I thank you for your courtesy in receiving me, and for your recognition that my husband was murdered unjustly. I hope an accord can be reached without further bloodshed." Stannis gave a curt nod. "I do not crave bloodshed, Lady Stark, but I will do what must be done." Melisandre smiled, a mysterious, knowing twist of her lips. "The flames have more to show me. War is coming. Let us hope the wolf chooses the right side of the flame, lest it be consumed." Catelyn departed Stannis's camp, her heart heavier than when she arrived. She sensed no warmth of alliance there, only an iron sense of duty and a cold, precise justice that left no room for negotiation. For the Baratheon in Dragonstone, the realm was black and white. Either they joined him or they were his enemies. It reminded Catelyn of Ned's sense of honor in some ways, but with a hardness that lacked Ned's compassion. She found herself thinking that if forced to choose between Stannis and Renly as an ally, Robb might find Renly more malleable, more willing to grant the North the near independence they desired. Yet choosing Renly meant going against Stannis's rightful claim by birth. It was a dreadful puzzle, and she did not look forward to delivering the news to her son. When finally she returned to Riverrun, weary from her long travels and heavy with conflicting tidings, she found that Robb's camp was bristling with new developments of its own. Edmure Tully, her brother, had taken a more assertive role in defending the Riverlands. The Great John was eager for a more decisive strike against the Lannisters. Roose Bolton was dispatching scouts throughout the region, gleaning intelligence on Tywin Lannister's movements. Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, urged caution, for rumor had it that Tywin was amassing a force near Harrenhal. Robb had barely slept. His responsibilities grew by the day. Yet despite the exhaustion that lined his face, Robb greeted his mother with warmth and relief. She told him everything. About Renly's offers of privileges under the Iron Throne, about Stannis's uncompromising demand for fealty, about the sense that war would soon envelop all corners of the realm if an agreement was not reached swiftly. Robb listened carefully, pacing near the hearth in Riverrun Solar. "So, Renly would allow the North near total freedom, provided I bend the knee and renounce my crown. But Stannis demands absolute submission, with no crown and no special privileges, only the standard arrangement of Warden of the North." Catelyn nodded. "That is correct. Renly, while not the elder brother, may well be the more politically astute. He knows he needs the North's support if he hopes to take King's Landing with minimal bloodshed. But he also lacks Stannis's legal claim and, perhaps, the respect that might command. His entire approach is based on popularity and alliances. He does have the Tyrells behind him. That is a formidable asset." Robb turned and faced the flickering flames, a storm of thought passing behind his gray eyes. "And Stannis, if I refuse him, will come for the North. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. The same is likely true of Renly if I spurn him, though he seems more likely to be open to negotiation." Catelyn folded her hands. "The question is, which alliance best serves the North, and which is most in line with your father's legacy? Ned was a man of honor. He would not want the realm plunged into chaos. He would also not want us to place blind faith in a man who might betray us." Robb exhaled slowly. "We wanted an alliance, but now we have two possibilities. One is with the older brother, a hard, uncompromising man who will not concede an inch. The other is with the younger brother, more flexible but with a weaker claim. Both will demand that I give up my crown. My lords will hate that. They named me king with their hearts full of rage and grief for my father. She dared to place a gentle hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in the muscles there. Whatever choice you make, some of your bannermen will object. You must weigh what is best for our people. The Riverlands continue to suffer. Winterfell may soon need your protection. We cannot fight a war on multiple fronts indefinitely, nor can we stand alone if both Baratheon brothers decide to brand us rebels. He nodded, expression grim. I may need to call another council, but I suspect what the lords will say. The Great John will demand we keep our crown. Roose Bolton might see advantage in playing the brothers off one another. Lady Mormont will vow that the North yields to no one. But for every day we wait, more fighting ravages the countryside. I wonder, Mother, is there a path to a true alliance with the Baratheons that preserves our freedom? Or must we yield the crown for the sake of peace? She did not have an answer, and so Robb called his lords once again, gathering them in Riverrun's great hall, much as before. This time, they came with even stronger opinions, for the war had escalated, and the horrors had multiplied. News of Lannister atrocities in the Riverlands had reached them. Villages burned, small folk slaughtered. Tywin Lannister was punishing the River Lords for their part in supporting Robb. The gathered lords' hearts raged. Some demanded an immediate march on King's Landing. Others insisted on a drawn-out campaign to whittle down the Lannisters. Still others, like Lord Bolton, advocated cunning stealth. It took hours, well into the night, before Robb laid out the news of both Baratheon claims. When the Great John roared that the king in the north bows to no man, that was echoed by many. But then sober heads began to weigh in. Lord Jason Mallister, his hair streaked with silver, pointed out that if they insisted on Robb's absolute independence, they would have to fight two Baratheon claimants and the Lannisters. The odds were not promising. Ser Brynden Tully calmly pointed out that Renly's offer of wide-ranging autonomy might be enough to preserve the essence of northern independence, so long as it was enshrined in writing and sworn by oath. Roose Bolton added that if they allied with Renly and he proved too weak, they might still extricate themselves, if we are cunning enough. That was his phrase, laced with quiet menace. Robb listened without speaking until all had said their fill. Then he rose, leaning both hands on the table. The question is bigger than whether I am called king. The North has never been truly safe under Southern rule. My father served as hand, and look what befell him. We wanted the independence that Torrhen Stark once yielded centuries ago, because we believed it would keep us safe. But if we remain separate, we will face war from all sides. The Lannisters will not rest, Stannis will not rest, and likely Renly will not rest either, once he secures the throne. This is not about my pride or a crown. It is about protecting our people. If forging an alliance can achieve that, then we must consider it with open eyes. Silence followed his words. Men exchanged glances. Slowly, the Great John sank back, frowning mightily but saying nothing. Lady Mormont studied Robb with an unwavering stare. At last, Catelyn spoke from the shadows, her voice resonating with gentle strength. My lords, what Robb says is true. We cannot pretend we are an island entire of itself. We need allies if we are to survive. The question is, whose terms will we accept? The conversation resumed. Hours passed. Finally, a tentative consensus emerged. Renly Baratheon was the more agreeable partner, if a partnership must be made. They did not love the idea of giving up the king in the North title, but Renly's offer was the least likely to see them forcibly subdued in the future. And even if Stannis' claim was more legitimate, legitimacy mattered little if he refused to compromise. There was also the matter of allies. Renly had the Tyrells. If they sided with Renly, they would have the combined armies of the Reach and the North, plus the Riverlands. Together, they would dwarf the Lannisters. The war might end swiftly, thus sparing the realm more bloodshed. And once the war was won, the North would enjoy near independence under a flexible king, so long as certain conditions were set down. Some lords still grumbled, but there was a current of relief that perhaps this war could be won without further devastation. The next day, Ravens were prepared, letters drafted, and Robb set his seal upon them. He invited Renly Baratheon's representatives to meet with him in a neutral place, to hammer out the details of their alliance. He was resolved. He would yield the crown if, and only if, Renly granted the North widespread autonomy, recognized the injustice done to Ned Stark, punished the Lannisters, and ensured that future generations of Starks would not be threatened by the Iron Throne's whims. It was a monumental step, one that echoed Torrhen Stark's kneeling before Aegon the Conqueror so many centuries ago. An act that had been met with condemnation by some historians, but which had spared the North the fires of Dragonflame. Now, Robb hoped to spare his people the fires of war. If only the outcome would be so kind. In the weeks that followed, negotiations began in earnest. Renly dispatched Ser Loras Tyrell, Lord Randall Tarly, and several other highborn lords of the Reach to parley with Robb in a grand pavilion set up on a grassy plain just south of the Riverlands. The approach was fraught with tension. Both sides had scouts and outriders patrolling to ensure no treachery. But once the envoys met, the words spoken were polite, even cordial. Ser Loras, in shining armor, performed the courtesies demanded by chivalry, while Lord Tarly, a brusque and pragmatic man, spoke bluntly of terms. Robb sat with his own advisors, Catelyn, the Blackfish, and several northern lords who were adept at negotiations. Even Roose Bolton stood quietly in the background, occasionally whispering to Robb. It was a complicated dance of demands, compromises, and clarifications. The North insisted on no southern interference in its governance, no forced garrisons, no heavy levies. They wanted official condemnation of Joffrey's regime and a formal admission of Ned Stark's innocence. They wanted restitution for the war damage inflicted upon the Riverlands. Renly's envoys insisted that if the realm was to remain whole, the North must still accept the ultimate authority of the Iron Throne, pay some measure of taxes to support the crown, and provide troops if the realm was attacked from outside. For days, the discussions stretched. But eventually, a draft agreement took shape. Robb Stark would bend the knee to King Renly. In exchange, King Renly would name him Warden of the North and Protector of the Trident, a unique arrangement that gave the Starks near-royal prerogative over both the North and the Riverlands. Ned Stark's memory would be honored, his name cleared, and the Lannisters would be formally declared traitors to the crown. Once King's Landing was taken and Joffrey unseated, justice would be exacted. While these negotiations continued, ravens flew, some to the Eyrie, seeking a possible alliance with Lady Lisa Arryn, though her resolve was uncertain. Some to Storm's End, where Renly's core supporters were gathered, and some even attempted to reach Pike to dissuade Balon Greyjoy from raiding the North. War was still raging on multiple fronts, but the seeds of a grand coalition were sprouting. If Robb Stark and Renly Baratheon could unify their forces, they might well shatter the Lannisters. Then the only question was, what would Stannis do? Stannis, upon hearing of the negotiations, was predictably furious. He sent a curt letter to Robb, condemning him for supporting a usurper. He declared that if Robb would not bend the knee to the rightful king, he would be branded a traitor. But Stannis had fewer allies, and though his men were disciplined, the Stormlands were divided in their loyalties, with many having gone to Renly. The North, the Riverlands, and the Reach together represented a formidable power, quite possibly unstoppable if united under one banner. So it happened that one cool morning, with a gentle autumn wind rustling through the plains, Robb Stark rode to meet Renly Baratheon in person. The site chosen was a broad meadow near an ancient, half-ruined holdfast, neither side wanting to stray too close to the other's main camp. Each king came with a modest entourage, knights and bannermen sworn to keep the peace. Robb rode upon a gray stallion, clad in mail and a dark gray cloak pinned by a direwolf sigil. Beside him rode Catelyn, her posture regal, face composed. On Robb's other side, Theon Greyjoy twirled a spear with youthful arrogance, while the Blackfish and Lord Bolton followed at a measured distance. From the other direction came Renly Baratheon, resplendent in a cloak of green velvet, the golden crown of roses on his dark curls. By his side rode Margaery Tyrell, her face partially obscured by a hood, and Ser Loras in a shining breastplate bearing the Tyrell rose. Lord Randall Tarly, grim and imposing, flanked them with an expression that rarely showed anything but severity. When they met in the center, the two kings regarded each other. Robb was younger, but with a certain solemn gravity. Renly had an easy charm, a smile already on his lips. Yet, in that moment, there was a flicker of mutual respect. Both recognized that each commanded an army of thousands, and each had some claim to the future of the realm. Renly greeted Robb with a courteous bow of his head, though not a bow of obeisance. "Your Grace," he said, the courtesy ringing with subtle irony. Robb dipped his head in return. "Your Grace, I trust the ride was not too harsh." Renly flashed a grin. "Not at all. These are lands in bloom, soon to be harvested by a rightful king, or by two kings if we are not careful." Robb did not let the jibe unsettle him. "I came to speak plainly. I have read the terms your envoys and my counselors negotiated. If you will promise before your gods and mine that my father's honor will be restored, that the North and the Trident will remain under Stark governance, and that the Lannisters will be punished, I will bend the knee." Renly's smile softened. "You understand, of course, that as the rightful king, I cannot have two kings in the realm." "I do, and I am willing to relinquish the title, provided the terms are met." For a moment, the green plains were hushed. Catelyn could hear the distant trill of a bird hidden among the tall grass. Renly exchanged a glance with Marjorie. Then he spoke, voice rising so that all around could hear. "Then let it be known that I, Renly of House Baratheon, first of my name, do solemnly swear that Lord Eddard Stark's name shall be restored, that those responsible for his death shall face the king's justice, and that his son, Robb Stark, shall be named Warden of the North and Protector of the Trident, subject only to the Iron Throne and free from any undue interference in matters of local governance and law, so long as he remains loyal to Teach. Crown." Robb inhaled, a knot loosening in his chest. For a moment, he imagined his father's spirit watching. Perhaps Ned Stark would have disliked the notion of more war, but this might bring the realm closer to peace. If Renly made good on his word, the North would be safe, the Riverlands protected, and Ned's memory absolved of treason. It was more than Robb had dared hope for when he first proposed an alliance. Slowly, he swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted. Renly did the same. They stood face to face. With solemn gravity, Robb went down on one knee. The northern knights in his retinue shifted uncomfortably, but they did not protest. This was the moment they had braced themselves for. "My king," Robb said, looking up at Renly, "I vow to serve you loyally, so long as you uphold your promises. I vow to protect your realm from the Lannisters, from any threat, with all the strength of the North." Renly placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. "Rise, Lord Robb Stark, Warden of the North and Protector of the Trident. May our alliance herald a new dawn for Westeros." There, in that meadow, an accord was sealed. The northern retinue felt a pang of regret at relinquishing Robb's crown. But they could not deny a sense of relief. If this alliance held, they would march in force to King's Landing, crush the Lannisters, and restore peace. When it was done, they could return home with their lands unspoiled, their traditions unbroken, and Ned Stark's honor vindicated. Yet the realm's troubles were far from over. News soon reached them of Stannis' next move. He had marched to besiege Storm's End, claiming that Renly had usurped the seat of House Baratheon. Reports came that Renly's men were rallying. The Tyrells, too, were gathering their banners, preparing to defend Storm's End. War was coming, a confrontation between the two Baratheon brothers that would likely determine who truly held the claim to the Iron Throne. And if Renly fell to Stannis, what then would become of the North's alliance? Robb set his jaw when he heard the tidings. He knew that if their alliance was to mean anything, he would be honor-bound to march south with his men to aid Renly. Already, the Great John was eager for battle. Lord Bolton was curiously reserved, merely stating that they should wait for a proper plan. But Robb, with the vigor of youth and the cunning he had shown in his victories against the Lannisters, declared that they would not tarry. They would ride south, link with the main Tyrell host, and break Stannis' siege if they must. So it was that within weeks, the North and the Riverlands bristled with activity, preparing for a long march to the Stormlands. Robb divided his host, leaving a portion to hold the lines against the Lannisters to the west. He entrusted Brynden Tully with that command. Bryndon's task was to harry Tywin's forces, keep them pinned, ensure they could not ride south to join with either Baratheon. Meanwhile, Robb would take the bulk of his loyal Northmen and Riverlords down the roads toward the Reach and then to Storm's End. Before departing, Catelyn pressed her son's hands. "You are doing this to uphold the alliance, but be wary. This realm is rife with betrayals. Watch Renly closely. He may be your ally now, but you must ensure he does not treat you and your men as mere pawns." Robb nodded. "I will, but if we can achieve victory together, we can march on King's Landing swiftly. Then we can unseat Joffrey, bring justice to the Lannisters, and end this war." Their march south was long and grueling, though the late summer weather was kinder than a northern winter might have been. The men marched in columns, banners streaming in the wind. The direwolf of House Stark, the trout of House Tully, the black flayed man of Bolton, the sunburst of Karstark, the tall pine of Tallheart, and others. Villagers and small folk watched them pass, some with hope, others with fear. Many had never seen such a large northern host. Some offered bits of bread or fruit, touched by the stories they'd heard of the young wolf. Along the way, Robb encountered House Tyrell's vanguard, led by Lord Randall Tarley and a host of knights. They joined forces under a common cause, to break Stannis' siege of Storm's End. The great fortress loomed on the southeastern horizon, perched on the coast like a massive stone sentinel. Stannis' forces ringed it with siege engines, catapults, and disciplined formations. But as they approached, word reached them that Storm's End held firm under the command of Ser Courtenay Penrose, loyal to Renly. The arrival of the combined Northern and Tyrell host threatened to catch Stannis between the fortress and a newly united army. Stannis, for his part, refused to yield. Some said he dabbled in dark magic. Others claimed he was on the brink of breaching Storm's End's walls. Tensions soared. Scouts whispered that Stannis' men were demoralized, outnumbered, but their lord's iron will and the fiery faith of the Red Priestess kept them in line. Robb prepared for battle alongside Renly's host, though Renly himself had not yet arrived from the west. He was said to be gathering more support. For a moment, Robb considered whether it would have been wiser to await Renly's personal leadership. But Tarley insisted they had the advantage now, why squander it? Then came a fateful dawn. The Northmen and Tyrells deployed on a broad plain outside Storm's End. Stannis' camp was visible in the distance, the red glow of torchlight flickering in the early morning gloom. Robb rode at the head of his men, gray cloak snapping in the salt-tinged wind from the sea. He could smell the brine, hear the thunder of distant waves against the cliffs. Theon Greyjoy and the Great John flanked him, each eager for glory. Roose Bolton kept a distance behind, commanding a substantial portion of the foot. Before the horns could sound, a lone rider emerged from Stannis' lines, bearing a white banner of truce. He approached warily, outnumbered and overshadowed. Robb, ever cautious, rode forth with a small honor guard to meet him. It was Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight. He bore a grave expression. "My lords," he said in a respectful tone, "I come at the behest of King Stannis to request parley. He believes too much blood has been shed, and perhaps your alliance is misguided. He offers you a last chance to bend the knee before he must give the order to fight." Robb felt a pang of pity for the man. "Ser Davos, I know you are an honorable man, but I have bent the knee only to Renly Baratheon. I have sworn an oath. I cannot break that lightly." Davos's face was lined with worry. "Stannis is the rightful heir. He would show mercy to you and your men if you would only yield. Surely you see how outnumbered we are. But Stannis is determined. This battle will be costly. I beg you to reconsider." Robb recalled Stannis' cold stare, his unwavering stance. "Stannis would see me as a traitor. I cannot place my trust in a man who offers nothing but the chance to grovel. We fight with Renly. Our cause is just. My father must be avenged, the Lannisters punished." A flicker of resignation passed over Davos's face. "Then the Lord of Light protect us all. "I will convey your words, my lord." And with that, he turned his horse and rode back. So the horns sounded. The armies arrayed themselves in lines across the plain. The sky grew pale with the rising sun, a crimson glow shimmering along the horizon. Drums pounded, men hoisted shields, the ring of steel on steel as swords were drawn. The Tyrell cavalry formed ranks, their destriers stamping the ground. Northmen archers lined up behind rows of sharpened stakes. Boltons and Karstarks formed the infantry center, while the Greyjohn's men waited on one flank for the call to charge. The tension before battle was a living, breathing thing. Robb could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. He thought of Grey Wind, his direwolf companion, waiting just behind the lines with a small cluster of men to hold him until the charge. Theon tightened his grip on a spear. All around them, men licked dry lips and muttered prayers to the Seven or the old gods. Only the constant roar of distant surf and the call of seagulls broke the hush of waiting. Stannis' army, smaller but disciplined, arrayed itself in tight blocks. At their head, beneath a banner of the flaming heart and crowned stag, Stannis himself sat astride a dark horse, face grim as a statue carved from stone. Melisandre was nowhere to be seen on the field, but a swirl of red-robed priests moved among Stannis' men, chanting in a language unknown to most. A wave of disquiet spread through the Tyrell lines. Some rumored dark sorcery, that the night might spawn shadows to devour them. But Robb gritted his teeth. This was war. Whatever Stannis' conjurations might be, steel and courage would decide the day. Then the final call rang out, and the two armies surged toward one another. The thunder of hooves shook the earth as Tyrell knights galloped in wedge formation, leading the assault. Arrows whistled overhead, a deadly rain that hammered into the shields of Stannis' front lines. Stannis' archers answered with their own volley, and men and horses screamed as they fell. Still the charge thundered on. The great Jon roared an oath to the old gods and led his men in a furious run. The Bolton foot soldiers advanced with cold efficiency, rank by rank. Storm's End loomed beyond, its high walls and battered ramparts a silent witness to the carnage unfolding. Robb stayed near the center, commanding from a vantage point that let him see the sweep of the battlefield. He could feel the heat of battle rising, taste salt and dust in his mouth. Theon spurred forward, spear in hand, joining a cluster of Northmen who rushed to a gap forming in Stannis' lines. On the flank, Lord Tarly led the Tyrell infantry, smashing into Stannis' left. The clash was fierce, men hacking at each other with desperate force. Yet Stannis' men did not break. They closed ranks, pushing back with practiced discipline, and soon the field became a swirling melee of steel and blood. At the height of the battle, Robb glimpsed Stannis himself, sword raised, rallying his men. The grim lord cut down a Tyrell knight with a single stroke, never once relinquishing the scowl that carved his features. For a moment, Robb felt a spark of awe at the man's relentless will. But awe had no place here. This was a fight to the finish. Slowly, inexorably, the greater numbers of the allied host began to weigh on Stannis' lines. Gaps appeared. Tyrell cavalry circled to flank, cutting off routes of retreat. The Greyjohn's fierce assault hammered at the center. Arrows rained down, courtesy of the northern archers. Stannis fought like a cornered wolf, refusing to yield ground, urging his men to fight on. But they were surrounded. Storm's End's garrison, seeing that relief was at hand, even began a sally from the gates, harassing Stannis' rear lines. The defenders, starved for days, threw themselves at the siege lines with surprising ferocity. At last, the battered remnants of Stannis' army began to buckle. Davos Seaworth tried to rally a contingent of men on the left flank, but the Tyrell knights swept in. The great Jon led a savage push in the center, letting out a triumphant battle cry as Stannis' banner toppled. Realizing the day was lost, Stannis' men began a fighting retreat. Some turned and fled outright. Others kept discipline to the end, forming small knots of resistance that were overwhelmed by surging cavalry. Robb, seeking to show mercy, tried to halt any needless slaughter. "They are brave men," he shouted to his bannermen. If they yield, let them yield. In the final moments, Stannis himself was dragged from his horse, battered by the press of men. Lord Tarly's soldiers converged on him, disarming him. He was forced to his knees in the mud, eyes blazing with thwarted wrath. The Tyrell men who seized him shouted in triumph. The siege of Storm's End had ended in disaster for Stannis Baratheon. He was captured, his men scattered or forced to bend the knee on the spot. Robb stared across the field, chest heaving, blood spattered on his cloak. The sun had climbed higher, illuminating the carnage below. Groans of the wounded rose among the piles of dead. Ravens circled overhead. Theon emerged from the swirl, panting and grinning, a streak of blood across his cheek. The Great John was still roaring exultations, brandishing his sword in victory. Roose Bolton came forward, pale and calm, directing men to gather prisoners. Robb was shaken. This was the biggest battle he had ever led personally. He had won. Yet the weight of the victory pressed on him. So many dead, so many wounded. And among the captives was the rightful heir to the throne by birth, undone by the alliance that Robb had helped forge. Lord Tarly, victorious, approached Robb, flanked by Tyrell knights. "We have him, my lord," Tarly said. "Your father's murderer will soon follow, once we've taken King's Landing. But for now, this war is nearly over for the Stormlands. Storm's End is relieved. This is a great day." Robb nodded, slowly. "Let no one harm Stannis. He's a prisoner of war, but he fought honorably." Tarly inclined his head. "As you say, my lord." There was a stir, and the crowd of soldiers parted. Stannis was hauled before Robb. His lip was split, one eye bruised, but his posture still exuded a fierce, unbroken spirit. He glared at Robb with hatred. "Traitor," he spat. "I offered you mercy, and you throw in your lot with that pretender, Renly. The day will come when you will answer for this." Robb regarded him with pity and resolve. "I wanted justice for my father. You offered only subjugation. I did what I believed was right for my people. This is war, Stannis." Stannis's mouth tightened to a thin line. "I war. Then do what you will. I have failed." His voice was raspy, but he did not look away. Robb exhaled, the chaotic swirl of the battlefield behind him. "Put him under guard. We will decide his fate once Renly arrives." As Stannis was led away in chains, Robb felt a pang. The war had forced him to set brother against brother. In another life, perhaps Stannis could have been an ally, if only he had shown some measure of flexibility. But it was done. Days later, Renly Baratheon finally arrived at Storm's End with the main body of his forces. Jubilant cheers greeted him. The castle was his, the siege lifted, and his greatest rival was captured. He praised Robb for his valor, calling him the hero of the Stormlands. Renly declared a great feast to celebrate, though it was overshadowed by the piles of dead still being burned or buried on the field. Still, the men needed a taste of victory. In the feasting hall of Storm's End, as the great fires roared, Renly toasted Robb, lifted his wine goblet high, and called him the realm's savior. Though Robb tried to keep humble, the men cheered, brandishing their cups and hailing the young wolf. Renly's first order of business was to confront Stannis. They met in Storm's End's great hall, Stannis bound in chains, Renly seated upon the castle's ancient seat. The older brother stared holes into the younger, his face set in stony contempt. Renly tried to extend an olive branch. "You can have your life, brother, if you renounce your claim and acknowledge me as king." Stannis's voice was icy. "Never. You are a pretender. Do as you wish. I will not bend." Renly, in a show of magnanimity for the gathered lords, spared Stannis's life for the time being, locking him away in Storm's End's dungeon. Some among Renly's men, flush with triumph, called for Stannis's execution as a traitor. But Renly claimed that Stannis was still his brother. He would consider his fate after the Lannisters were brought low. Besides, killing Stannis might anger or demoralize those Stormlands lords who still admired him. It was a cold political calculation disguised as mercy. Robb said nothing, but in his heart, he was relieved not to see more blood spilled. The rest of Westeros reeled at the news. One Baratheon pretender had defeated the other, forging a massive alliance that now threatened to march on King's Landing. The Lannisters scrambled. Tywin pulled back to defend the capital, sending frantic ravens to the Westerlands, calling all banners. Tyrion, acting as hand, tried to shore up the city's defenses, while Cersei fumed behind closed doors, snapping at courtiers. Joffrey continued his cruelties with petty arrogance, ordering the city watch to put down any sign of unrest. But the tide had turned. The North, the Riverlands, and the Reach moved as one. Storm's End was secure. The Baratheon banners united, at least those that followed Renly. Thousands of men massed along the Rose Road, ready to march upon King's Landing. Robb Stark, no longer a king but a warden, commanded the respect of both northern and southern lords through his battlefield prowess and calm leadership. Renly, flush with success, grew more confident with each passing day, assured that once the Lannisters were crushed, the Iron Throne would be his. And Robb, in the quieter corners of Storm's End's courtyard, sometimes wondered if he had done right. He had promised the North independence, yet here he was, a vassal to a southern king. Still, that king was about to repay him by crushing the Lannisters, avenging Ned Stark. Perhaps that was a fair price to pay. So began the final march upon King's Landing. Renly led his triumphant host up the Rose Road, with Marjorie at his side. Robb rode ahead with the vanguard of northern scouts and outriders, ensuring they met no ambush. The Riverlords, under Edmure Tully, pressed in from another angle, crossing the Blackwater Rush to cut off any potential retreat by Lannister forces. Word spread through the Crownlands that a huge army was approaching, unstoppable in its might, determined to bring justice for Ned Stark and dethrone the boy King Joffrey. Thousands of small folk fled the capital or cowered behind its walls. As the allied host neared King's Landing, they established a siege outside the city's gates. The Tyrells took position near the King's Gate, the Northmen arrayed near the Gate of the Gods, and the Riverlords blocked off the Rose Road's approach. War engines were dragged into place, catapults aimed at the city walls. The farmland around King's Landing was swiftly overrun. Refugees crowded into the city, straining food supplies. Tension soared within the capital. The Gold Cloaks manned the ramparts, crossbows in hand. Tyrion Lannister tried to organize the defense, but the city faced a grim reality. These besieging forces dwarfed anything King's Landing could muster. Even with the might of the Red Keep, the Lannisters were grossly outnumbered. For days, the city refused to surrender. Cersei insisted that Joffrey remain defiant, that the walls could hold, that their father Tywin would arrive with reinforcements from the west. Joffrey raged, threatening to make an example of anyone who spoke of yielding. But morale crumbled. The people remembered what had happened during the reign of the Mad King, how Robert's forces had sacked the city. Now, ironically, Robert's youngest brother marched against the city, aided by the Starks. Many began to slip away from the walls at night, deserting. The Gold Cloaks, once loyal to the highest bidder, found that their purses were overshadowed by the enormous might arrayed outside. At last, Renly gave the city an ultimatum. He rode to the gates, flanked by Robb Stark, Ser Loras, and a retinue of knights. Before the assembled watchmen on the battlements, Renly called out, "I am Renly of House Baratheon, first of my name, rightful king of the Undulls and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms. Open yo. You are gates, surrender Joffrey and Cersei Lannister, and no harm shall befall the city. The realm needs peace, not further bloodshed." His words reverberated. There was no immediate response. But as night fell, word reached them from within. Elements of the Gold Cloaks were in open mutiny. Some wanted to throw open the gates, deliver Joffrey and his mother to Renly's justice, and end the siege. Others remained loyal out of fear, or perhaps out of loyalty to coin. Tension built within those walls like water behind a dam about to burst. 2 nights later, under cover of darkness, the city's gates swung open. A band of Gold Cloaks, led by officers sympathetic to Renly's cause, seized control of several key sections of the walls. They signaled with torches to the army outside. Immediately, Tyrell and northern troops rushed forward, capturing the gates with minimal resistance. Chaos erupted inside the city as some loyalist gold cloaks fought back, but the outcome was never in doubt. By dawn, King's Landing was effectively in Renly's hands. No great sack followed, for Renly had ordered discipline and offered protection to the citizens. But arrests were carried out en masse. The Red Keep still stood in partial defiance. Word came that Joffrey, Cersei, and Tyrion had retreated behind the keep's walls, possibly with the Kingsguard still loyal to them. It fell upon Robb Stark and a selected force of northern knights to help secure the city's lower districts, to ensure no looting occurred, and to calm the populace. He found himself riding through streets thick with tension, small folk peering from shuttered windows. Some recognized the direwolf sigil on his surcoat and cried out, "Stark! Stark for justice!" Others cowered, fearing a new wave of violence. Robb recalled how his father had walked these streets, tried to protect these people, and found it both eerie and humbling that he now stood in a position of authority. He vowed to honor his father's memory, to maintain order and show mercy. Renly, meanwhile, with Margaery and Ser Loras, led a contingent of knights and men-at-arms to the Red Keep's gates. After a tense standoff, the Kingsguard parted to reveal that Tyrion Lannister had taken charge. He had convinced Cersei and Joffrey that further resistance was futile. Cersei raged, hurling insults and threats, while Joffrey wept or cursed by turns, but Tyrion persuaded them to surrender before the keep was stormed and they were all killed. Thus ended the short but bloody reign of Joffrey Baratheon. Renly's men dragged him and Cersei from the throne room, while Tyrion, eyes downcast, quietly yielded himself to the new king's mercy. The Iron Seat was Renly's for the taking. The lords of the allied host crowded into the throne room, battered from war but triumphant. Robb lingered near the back, uncertain of his place in this southern hall of power, until Renly beckoned him forward. And so, in front of lords and knights, Renly ascended the Iron Throne, the metal blades of conquest forming a jagged silhouette around him. Margaery stood at his side, crowned as queen. The Tyrell rose, scenting the air. Silence reigned for a moment. Then Renly raised his voice, proclaiming his kingship, thanking the men who had fought to bring peace. And he called forth Robb Stark. "My lords," Renly said, "it is thanks to this man, Robb Stark of Winterfell, that we stand victorious. He bent the knee not out of weakness but out of wisdom. He forged this alliance for the good of the realm. Many men would have clung to their crowns and titles, even if it meant ruin. But not him. It is my pleasure, nay my honor, to name him Warden of the North and Protector of the Trident. May he rule his lands with the same wisdom he has shown us all, and may our alliance endure for the good of the Seven Kingdoms." The hall erupted in applause. The northern lords stomped their feet. The Tyrell knights cheered. Robb bowed before Renly, though his heart still twisted with conflicting feelings. He had given up the title of king in the north. Yet, in doing so, he had avenged his father's murder and secured peace and prosperity for his people. The Lannisters were subdued, their main seat of power taken. Joffrey's monstrous reign was ended. The realm under Renly might be calmer, more prosperous, as he had always boasted. And Robb himself, with near-total autonomy to govern the North and the Riverlands, had effectively restored House Stark's ancient prestige, short of the actual crown. In the days that followed, Ned Stark's name was officially cleared by royal decree. Documents were produced, witnesses gave testimony, and Renly declared that Lord Eddard Stark had been unlawfully executed. He paid tribute to Ned's honor as Hand of the King under Robert. A statue was commissioned to stand in the Red Keep's courtyard, commemorating Ned Stark's loyalty. Cersei and Joffrey, in a humiliating spectacle, were forced to stand trial for treason. Joffrey, bellowing curses, was stripped of his royal garments and carted off to a tower cell to await the king's final decision on his fate. Tywin Lannister, still in the field with a battered army, found himself outmaneuvered and sent envoys pleading for peace. Renly demanded harsh terms, the surrender of certain fortresses, the payment of heavy reparations, and that Tywin kneel and acknowledge him as king. The proud lion choked on the demands but ultimately relented, for he had no army left to stand against the combined might of the new regime. Thus it was that the realm settled into an uneasy peace. The major threat was quelled, though pockets of rebellion and resentful lords remained. Balon Greyjoy stirred on Pike, hearing that the North's armies had marched south. But Theon quickly returned home to negotiate with his father, trying to dissuade him from any foolish raids. Stannis languished in Storm's End's dungeons, refusing to bend the knee. Renly considered what to do with him, and some whispered that the Red Priestess had vanished, leaving behind a trace of dread and rumors of shadowy magic. For the time being, Stannis was a captive. The crown was settled firmly on Renly's head. When at last Robb prepared to depart King's Landing, leading his Northmen and Riverlords homeward, he could scarcely believe how much had happened. He had come south as a king. He left as a lord, yet one who had safeguarded his people in a way that might have been impossible if he clung to his crown. As he rode through the city gates, the small folk cheered for the young wolf, calling blessings upon him for ending the war. And in the bustle of the streets, he thought he saw, for just a moment, a figure that looked like his father, tall and serious, with gray eyes full of quiet pride. But when he looked again, there was no one there, just the swirl of the crowd. Robb rode on, flanked by Catelyn, Theon, and his loyal lords, heading back to the north at last. He left behind a realm entering a new era under Renly Baratheon. Some might call it a golden age. Renly's youth, charm, and the Tyrell wealth could spark a prosperous future. Others foresaw hidden perils, resentful lords, or the possibility of more civil strife. But for the moment, the realm was united under a single king, the Lannisters humbled, the memory of Ned Stark avenged. When Robb crossed the Trident on his homeward road, he felt the wind from the north upon his face. He closed his eyes, imagining the thick forests of the Wolfswood, the towers of Winterfell, the quiet hush of snow. The war was over for now. The North still belonged to the Starks, and though he had set aside his crown, he had found a way to protect his people and honor his father's legacy. If there were regrets, and there were, he kept them close. Some nights, in the hush of his tent, he wondered if he had done the right thing in trusting Renly, in chaining Stannis, in bending the knee. He wondered if his father would have approved. Yet each time, he reminded himself of the thousands of lives spared, of the unburnt fields of the North and Riverlands, of the look in his mother's eyes when she told him that Ned would be proud. And, in time, the ache receded, replaced by a steely resolve to watch over the North with vigilance. The Game of Thrones had not ended. It never truly ended. But the North had made its move, forging a Stark or Baratheon alliance that would reverberate through the annals of Westeros. And for better or worse, the young wolf had changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms forever. Robb Stark had never felt the weight of the North sky as heavily as he did upon his return. Each step that carried him northward seemed to peel away the clamor and heat of the South, leaving only the crisp, cool promise of home. After so many battles and anxious councils, the forests and hills beyond the Neck felt like a balm to his soul. The men with him, stalwart Northmen, river lords, and a few knights from the Crownlands tasked with courtesy escort, sensed the subtle shift in the air as well. Gone was the tang of salt and the sting of the warmer sun. Autumn was in full bloom here, the leaves a blaze of gold and red, with the morning fog drifting through the pines and the ancient oaks. It was a beautiful tapestry, if somewhat somber, befitting the changes that had swept over their young lord. He was not the king in the North anymore. He was warden of the North and protector of the Trident. He had knelt to Renly Baratheon, forging a union that ended Joffrey's reign and left Stannis Baratheon imprisoned in Storm's End. It had brought a cautious peace to the realm. Some might argue it came at the cost of northern dignity, set aside for the sake of southern alliances. But Robb carried no outward sign of regret. Pride would have demanded that the wolf stand alone. Wisdom demanded otherwise. Now, as he drew closer to Winterfell, he felt anxious knots twisting in his stomach. He had left the castle months ago as a boy who had been dubbed a king. He returned as a man who had chosen to yield that title for the good of his people. Would his bannermen accept him still? Would his siblings understand? At Moat Cailin, the half-ruined fortress guarding the southern entry into the north, the Watchers waved the Stark banner with renewed fervor. The story of Robb's success had traveled swiftly by Raven. Rumors said the new king Renly had recognized the injustice done to Lord Eddard Stark, that the Lannisters were in disarray and forced to pay indemnities. Some murmured that the North and Riverlands were virtually independent in all but name. To many of the soldiers at Moat Cailin, that was enough, though they might still wonder why a Stark had bent the knee to a Baratheon yet again. As Robb and his escort ascended the causeway to the fortress, the men cried out welcomes, and the sound of it tugged at Robb's heart. He met their shouts with a sober nod, too weary to pretend at unbridled joy. Lady Catelyn rode at his side, swathed in a heavy gray cloak lined with fox fur. The wind plucked at the ends of her auburn hair. She seldom showed weariness, but Robb knew the toll the journey had taken on her. They had witnessed bloodshed in the Riverlands, grief and fear in King's Landing, and the uncertain intricacies of an alliance at Storm's End. Yet here she was, upright and graceful, offering him small smiles now and again, as if to remind him that they had survived worse. She was his mother, after all, and the Starks endured. They passed through the old gatehouse, greeted by the ranking officer left in charge, a gruff man named Galbart Glover, who promptly bowed and welcomed his lord home. "My lord, my warden," he said, stumbling slightly over the new form of address. "All is well at Moat Cailin. The roads remain clear, though we've received worrying tales from the west." Robb dismounted, boots crunching on the rough stones. "The west? Do you mean the Ironborn?" he asked, his mind immediately flicking to Theon Greyjoy, who had parted from them earlier to parley with his father at Pike. Robb knew, deep down, how precarious Theon's loyalty might be. "Has there been word of raiding?" "Only rumors," Glover replied. "No sightings yet. The Neck is quiet, but travelers from further up the coast speak of ironborn ships seen near the rills and perhaps off the stony shore." Catelyn frowned. "Then Balon Greyjoy wastes no time. He sees we have returned from war, but perhaps he imagines the North is weak." Robb felt a ripple of concern. He had hoped Theon's presence on Pike could avert a crisis, but Balon Greyjoy was notorious for seizing advantage. "Keep your vigilance," he instructed Glover. "If anything moves in the west, send word immediately. We are needed at Winterfell, but I'll not let the Ironborn catch us unprepared." With that, they rested briefly, taking bread and salt in Moat Cailin's hall. Though the fortress was little more than 3 squat towers and a warren of half-sunken walls, Robb felt a flicker of pride seeing the Stark direwolf banner fluttering overhead. No matter the titles or alliances, this was still Stark land, and he was still a Stark. After a short respite, the column pressed onward. The roads were muddy in places, thanks to autumn rains, but the north was at last free from the heavier ravages of war. Here and there, Robb saw minor farmland left abandoned when men marched south, yet he knew the harvest was ongoing. He noticed the signs of small folk returning. A barn repaired, a field half-plowed, a woman and child glimpsed at the edge of the wood, watching the riders pass with wary curiosity. The presence of so many armed men was always cause for fear. Robb tried to keep his escort as orderly and polite as possible, mindful that the war's horrors had not spared even the lonely corners of the realm. They crossed the last river, and at last, the tall, ancient oaks of the Wolfswood enveloped them in deep shadow. The crisp scent of pine and damp earth was almost overwhelming. Robb inhaled, remembering childhood hunts with his father, wondering if the memory would ever stop stinging. Ned Stark was gone, but his spirit lived on in these woods. That thought comforted and saddened Robb in equal measure. When Winterfell's great towers finally came into view, Robb felt his throat tighten. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and the thick granite walls rose against a sky of pale gray. He glimpsed the first banner on the battlements, another direwolf, proud and steadfast. Home. He spurred his horse forward, mother by his side, and the guards on the walls shouted the alarm that the Lord had returned. Within moments, the massive gates groaned open. Men rushed forth, among them Maester Luwin, old and bent but with a welcoming smile. Beside him stood a cluster of household staff and a handful of Stark guards, all eager to see the young wolf's face in person again. Robb dismounted, bracing himself for the swirl of emotion. Catelyn set foot on the courtyard ground with a sigh that might have been relief. They embraced, mother and son, right there by the gate, ignoring the stares of onlookers. It was a moment of raw humanity they had not permitted themselves in King's Landing or Storm's End. Then Robb released her and turned to greet the others. Maester Luwin's eyes shone with moisture as he bowed. "My lord, it gladdens my old heart to see you safe." Robb clasped the maester's shoulders. "It's good to be back. Please, how fares my family? How fares Bran, Rickon?" "Safe and healthy, by the gods' grace," Luwin said quickly, glancing over Robb's shoulder at the knights who followed. "We have had no trouble within these walls, though there have been disturbing tidings from the wall. A message arrived from Castle Black, you see, speaking of wildlings on the move and unsettling rumors. I hoped you would read it as soon as you returned." Robb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He nodded curtly. "I will. For now, let me see my brothers." The crowd parted, and from the covered walkway near the great keep, two figures approached. One was Bran, sitting atop Hodder's broad shoulders, the gentle giant carrying him as though he weighed nothing. Beside them was young Rickon, bounding forward on short legs that had grown a bit longer since Robb last saw him. Rickon's face was a mix of relief and budding tears. Bran's eyes were keen, measuring his older brother. Summer and Shaggy Dog, their direwolves, lurked behind them, each animal's yellow eyes bright with canine intelligence. "Robb," Rickon blurted, throwing his arms around Robb's waist as soon as he was near enough. Robb knelt, hugging the boy back. "You came home," the child mumbled into Robb's cloak, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. Robb patted his younger brother's head, ruffling the shaggy hair. "Of course I did, little one." He looked up at Bran then, who tried to maintain a more reserved front, though his trembling smile betrayed his emotion. Hodder bent his knees, allowing Bran to get closer. Bran reached out and Robb clasped his hand. "Welcome back," Bran managed. How was the war?" His voice sounded older, laced with a gravity that pained Robb to hear. Bran was a boy who had lost too much too soon. "It was difficult," Robb said quietly, "and it still isn't truly over. But for now, the worst is behind us. I missed you both. I'll tell you all of it, but let's go inside first. I need a fire's warmth and a moment to rest my bones." Bran nodded, and Rickon clung to Robb's arm all the way into the keep. Along the way, stable hands rushed to take the horses, greeting them all with murmurs of "Welcome home, my lord," and "The gods be good, your mother's safe too." The great hall bustled as more folk rushed about, preparing hot meals, stoking fires. It was a frenzy of activity that made Robb realize how starved he was for normalcy. If this was the future he had won by bending the knee, peaceful halls, family safe, it might be worth any crown he had relinquished. They gathered in the solar that overlooked the courtyard, a warm chamber lined with shelves of old books and the heads of long-dead beasts from the wolfswood. Catelyn, mindful of the dust of travel, excused herself for a short while to wash and change. Robb sank into a wooden chair near the fire, allowing the heat to soak into his muscles. Bran and Rickon stayed close, each demanding bits of explanation. "How many battles did you fight?" Rickon asked, wide-eyed. "Did you kill 100 men? Did you kill the Boy King?" Robb tried to keep his tone gentle. "I fought, yes, but war's not something you should be eager for, Rickon. And as for the Boy King, Joffrey's alive, but he's no longer king." He thought of that day in King's Landing when they had pulled Joffrey from the Iron Throne. The boy's shrill curses still echoed in Robb's memory. "Renly Baratheon sits the throne now." Bran folded his arms, expression thoughtful. "And does that mean the North is no longer free?" It was a child's question, guileless but piercing. Robb flinched inwardly. He nodded slowly. "We are part of the realm again, Bran. but with a promise of independence in all but name. We keep our own laws, govern ourselves, and no southern lord shall hold power here. I've promised our swords to King Renly if there's a threat to the realm, but he's granted us vast autonomy. It was the best I could do to protect us from further bloodshed. Bran's gaze flickered toward the window. Father was always loyal to Robert Baratheon, he murmured. I suppose you did what he might have done if it kept us safe. Robb felt a lump in his throat. He hoped so. He dearly hoped so. They spoke a while longer, Rickon drifting off to chase Shaggy Dog when the direwolf tried to chew on the corner of an old tapestry, leaving Bran and Robb to share a subdued moment. Finally, Maester Luwin entered, carry. ING a sheaf of parchments. My lord, I have the recent ravens for you to read whenever you're ready. Robb stood, heavy-lidded with travel fatigue but determined. I'll look at them now. He turned to Bran. Stay if you like. I have no secrets from you, though some of this might be complicated. Bran nodded, and Hodder, who had been standing quietly, lumbered forward to support him. Luwin spread the parchments out on a table near the hearth. There were messages from the Rills, from the Dreadfort, from White Harbor. Letters from lords proclaiming their loyalty or giving updates on their harvest. One from Lady Mormont on Bear Island, congratulating Robb on the alliance with Renly, albeit in tersely worded fashion. But then came the letter from Castle Black, sealed with black wax. Robb broke the seal and read, his eyes scanning quickly. The further he read, the deeper his frown became. Wildlings uniting under some self-styled king beyond the wall. A massive migration. The Lord Commander calls for more men. Robb paused, glancing at Bran, who stared back with concern. They say the wildlings are fleeing something. There are rumors of the dead walking. Bran's breath caught. Old Nan used to tell tales of that. The others, White Walkers. Robb grimaced. Tales. And yet, the Night's Watch believes it enough to send a warning. My father always said the Watch does not send such ravens lightly. They're too few up there, no doubt. There's been precious little support from the Crown for the Watch in recent years. Robb thought of how the new alliance might change that. He was Warden of the North. It fell to him to defend the Wall. We may need to muster more men to bolster them. Maester Luwin adjusted his chain collar, the links clinking. We could send a few hundred, though many of our fighting men remain in the south, or still en route home. Robb shook his head. We'll do what we must. The Wall is our first line of defense. I'll not leave them to face a horde of wildlings alone. Or anything worse. The letter's mention of the dead gave him a chill. He reminded himself it was likely just a rumor. Still, the sincerity in the Lord Commander's words was disquieting. I'll write to King Renly as well. Our alliance might mean more resources for the Watch. He set the parchment aside. A wave of exhaustion washed over him. We'll handle that in the coming days. For now, Maester, let the Lords of the North know we're home. Summon them for a council in Winterfell if they can attend quickly. I need to discuss the ironborn threat and the matter of the Watch. As you say, my lord. Luwin gathered the scrolls, bowing. Bran watched him depart, then looked back at Robb. Do you think the ironborn will attack us here? Bran asked softly. I don't know, Robb admitted. Balon Greyjoy is an unpredictable man. Theon's gone to treat with him. Perhaps that will be enough to keep him from raiding. But if not, we'll meet him with steel and drive him back into the sea. Bran nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. Robb knew that look. They'd all seen too much war to believe it would be easy. He forced a reassuring smile, ruffled Bran's hair. Don't fret. The North is strong, and we have allies. Get some rest, little brother. Bran asked Hodder to carry him out, leaving Robb alone with the crackling fire and the silent ghosts of memory. He rubbed his temples, thinking of all that lay ahead. The Ironborn, the Night's Watch pleas for help, the unhealed wounds left by war. And somewhere in the dungeons at Storm's End, Stannis Baratheon languished, unrepentant. Tywin Lannister nursed his humiliations in the Westerlands, forced to concede but unlikely to forget. Peace had come, but it was a fragile, newborn thing that could easily crumble beneath an onslaught of new troubles. Robb knew he must be vigilant. He needed sleep. Yet, he found himself unable to rest until he had seen every corridor of Winterfell once more. He toured the ramparts in the deepening twilight, stepping past guards who saluted him. The sight of the old stone made his heart clench with bittersweet joy. He could almost see his father, Ned, standing there, gazing out across the snow-laden rooftops in winter, or scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. That memory gave him both comfort and an ache so profound it nearly stole his breath. Eventually, as the sky blackened into true night, he headed for his chambers. Catelyn waited there to bid him good night, her eyes full of maternal worry. She laid a hand on his cheek, and he saw tears shimmering. "Your father would be proud of you," she said softly. "You've borne a crown and set it aside for the sake of our people." Robb closed his eyes, allowing that comfort to flow through him. "I hope so, Mother. I miss him every day." She nodded, blinking away her tears. "As do I. Rest now. There will be time for councils and ravens in the morning." And so Robb Stark, the young wolf no longer crowned, but still revered in his own land, drifted to sleep in the same bed where he once lay as a boy, feeling the weight of the entire North upon him in a way he had never known before. Winterfell woke early the next day. Servants bustled, dogs barked in the courtyards, stable boys readied horses for short rides, and the lords who had arrived in haste assembled for the morning meal. In the great hall, steaming plates of bread, bacon, and stewed apples covered the tables. The high seats stood empty until Robb entered with Catelyn. All eyes followed them as they walked up the length of the hall. Lords from across the north rose to greet him. Lord Wyman Manderly of White Harbor, still plump and ruddy, though sorrowful at the memory of men lost in the war. Lady Meage Mormont, arms folded, her face set in a fierce scowl as though she were prepared to wrestle a bear at a moment's notice. Rickard Karstark, who had lost sons at the Trident and whose eyes still burned with subdued anger whenever the Lannisters were mentioned. Others were there too, the Dustons, the Lockes, the Tallhearts, the Flints. A smaller gathering than might have been if more had not gone south or died there, but enough to signify the North's leadership was present. They took their seats, and Robb gestured for them all to sit as well, keeping the atmosphere as cordial as possible. "My lords, ladies," he began, voice carrying through the hall, "thank you for answering my summons so swiftly. We have much to discuss. The war is over in the south, for the time being. King Renly holds the Iron Throne. The Lannisters are forced to pay restitution, and Joffrey is no longer king." A murmur spread across the gathered crowd. Some eyed Robb with relief, others with lingering unease. Wyman Manderly cleared his throat. "Does that mean the North's lost cause for independence?" He voiced the question with careful diplomacy, but the tension was evident. Robb inclined his head. "I know many of you witnessed the crowning in the Riverlands and swore oaths to the king in the north. Our stance has changed. I will not lie to you or pretend otherwise. But let me be clear. We have secured an arrangement that gives the north far more freedom than it's known in centuries. We are a part of the realm in name, but we answer to no southern lord unless the realm is threatened. We pay only a minimal tribute, we keep our own governance, and no stranger will ever be installed as overlord in Winterfell." He paused, letting those words settle. That was the price of a swift end to the war and the guarantee that the Lannisters would face justice for killing my father. For a moment, silence hung over the table. Then Meage Mormont spoke, her voice gravelly but not hostile. "You won us peace, young Stark, and the Lannisters didn't come burning our villages. I'll not begrudge you that. But is the crown done meddling with the north? No scuttling about our harbors, or pressing men to fight distant southern wars." Robb met her gaze. "King Renly has promised to respect our autonomy. If there is a foreign threat, if the realm is invaded, then yes, we must honor the alliance. Otherwise, the north remains ours to rule." Most of the lords murmured approval or at least acceptance. Some still wore uncertain frowns, but none rose to challenge him outright. The war had been fierce, and many recognized that if Robb had insisted on absolute independence, They might have faced the combined might of every other region in Westeros. Better to hold a privileged place within a large realm than to risk the devastation of the north. Sensing the tension easing, Robb leaned forward. We have two imminent concerns. The first is the ironborn. I sent Theon Greyjoy to parley with his father, hoping to forestall any raids. We have yet to receive word of the outcome. But sightings of ironborn ships near our western coasts are worrying. We must be prepared to defend ourselves. Rickard Karstark's eyes narrowed. Your Grace, my lord, I never trusted that Greyjoy boy. Balon Greyjoy will not pass on an opportunity to strike. He's been waiting for years to pay us back for our part in crushing his rebellion. Robb nodded, bracing for the rancor that often arose at Theon's name. I understand your reservations. Theon grew up here as my father's ward, and he fought beside us in the south. I want to believe he's loyal, but I also know his father's ambitions. So we stay vigilant. I'll dispatch ravens to our western lords. They must patrol the coasts, fortify their defenses. Wyman Manderly coughed. White Harbor can send a few ships as well. We don't have a large navy, but we'll do our part. The Mander is well guarded, but the open seas, that's another matter. Good. We'll coordinate a strategy to keep them from landing in force. Robb rubbed a hand over his jaw, remembering his father's remarks about Pike. Balon Greyjoy was prideful, cunning. A direct assault on the north would be bold, but not impossible. If Theon's diplomacy fails, we'll know soon enough. A wave of guarded assent passed around the table. Robb took a small breath, then shifted to the next urgent matter. Now, regarding the Night's Watch, I've received a raven from Castle Black. They warn of wildlings uniting in unprecedented numbers. Some speak of the King Beyond the Wall, Mance Rayder. The Watch fears an invasion if these wildlings pass the wall. Galbart Glover, who had arrived after riding swiftly from Moat Cailin, rested an elbow on the table. Wildlings? Always a nuisance, but an invasion. They might have some raids, but enough to trouble the entire north. Robb tapped the table. The Lord Commander believes so. The watchers on the wall see signs of a massive gathering. We can't dismiss it. The Watch is also badly under strength, more so after years of neglect. Karstark leaned in, mustache twitching. So do we send men to join the Night's Watch? That is a harsh duty. Most families wouldn't relish condemning more sons to that life. It need not be a condemnation, Robb answered quietly. We can at least send arms, supplies, volunteers, perhaps. Men who have no land or who might prefer service at the wall rather than wandering aimlessly after this war. He glanced around at the gathered lords. If we ignore the threat and the wildlings break through, we'll have chaos in the north. They'll pillage from the Frostfangs to the White Knife. A hush fell. The Northmen were proud, but the notion of tens of thousands of wildlings ravaging their lands was sobering. After a moment, Manderly sighed. We can gather some provisions from White Harbor and send them up the King's Road. Enough grain and salted fish to help the Watch through the winter. I might persuade some men to volunteer. I cannot spare many soldiers for the Black, but a few, perhaps. Others began to nod. Meej Mormont promised at least a handful of fighting women from Bear Island, if the Watch would accept them. Karstark grumbled that he would see if a few lesser sons might be willing. Bit by bit, a plan formed. It would not be a vast relief army, just a steady trickle of supplies and volunteers. Robb resolved to do more if necessary, but for now it was a start. He felt a strange sense of pride. Here he was, not a crowned king, yet forging real unity among his lords, addressing dangers before they could erupt. It might have been easier to keep fighting in the south, to cling to the illusions of kingship, but that path would have meant losing everything. Now the north was battered but whole. That council lasted well past midday, until finally, Robb declared it concluded. The lords lingered, discussing details among themselves, forging new alliances over cups of ale. Catelyn approached him, eyebrows raised. You've grown into your role well, she remarked softly. Your father would have done the same, gathering the lords to address threats rather than ignoring them. Robb mustered a small smile. I'm only doing what must be done. Nothing more. She placed a gentle hand on his forearm. Sometimes that's all the realm needs. In the days that followed, ravens flew across the north. The coastal lords battened down watchtowers and patrolled for any ironborn incursion. Farmers in the interior noted the call for men to join the night's watch or at least send supplies. Blacksmiths hammered out arrowheads, spear points, and warm cloaks for the potential volunteers. Slowly, the north steeled itself for whatever trouble might come next. Robb oversaw it all, drawing on the authority vested in him by Renly's agreement. Some knights from the south lingered in Winterfell, a courtesy retinue from the crown, though they were ill-prepared for the northern chill and eyed the old godswood with wary curiosity. Bran asked endless questions about the war, about the capital, about the knights who bore shining armor. He listened intently to the tales of Renly's victory over Stannis, the hush that fell when Robb described capturing the older Baratheon. Catelyn tried to shield Bran from the more gruesome details, but Robb chose honesty in measure. Bran was no longer an infant. If the realm was truly on the brink of new dangers, he deserved to know enough to be prepared. Arya was still missing, last heard to be somewhere in the Riverlands, having escaped the city after Ned's death. Sansa was in King's Landing, theoretically freed from betrothal to Joffrey but still in uncertain standing. Renly's men had found her in the Red Keep and placed her under the Queen's protection, Queen Marjorie now. At least that was the last letter Robb had received. It reassured him somewhat to think his sister was no longer at the mercy of the Lannisters, yet she remained far away, out of reach. Robb comforted himself that Sansa was safe from further cruelty, if Marjorie Tyrell's courtesy was to be believed. As for Arya, no word. Robb prayed daily that she was alive, that the gods might guide her north again. A fortnight passed. The chill deepened. Autumn days shortened, and nights fell cold and star-splashed. Robb took to walking the walls at dawn, recalling how Ned used to greet the morning light. He found it brought him a sense of quiet purpose. Then, one morning, a raven arrived from the west, carrying a message sealed with the Kraken sigil of House Greyjoy. Robb's heart lurched when Maester Luwin handed it to him. He broke the seal and read quickly, flanked by Catelyn, who watched his face for any sign of the contents. Lord Stark, the letter began, a studied courtesy. Balon Greyjoy, King of the Isles and the North, greets you. Your ward, Theon Greyjoy, begs me to keep peace. Yet the Ironborn do not beg. We take. I have launched my ships along your western coasts. My men have seized Deepwood Motte. The banner of the Kraken flies in the north. Robb felt his blood run cold, a fury welling in his chest. He kept reading. I suggest you do not resist. The Stony Shore, Sea Dragon Point, and Deepwood Motte now belong to the Iron Isles. We will press inland if you attempt to retake these lands. If you remain in Winterfell and do not hinder us, we may allow you to keep your seat. Otherwise, the old way will wash the north in salt and iron. No signature, no regard. Just the scrawl of a man who had declared himself King of the Isles and the North. A direct challenge to Renly's crown and a brazen betrayal of the Starks' trust. The letter's final lines mention Theon in passing. Your pup begs me for mercy. Let him learn to reap with us, or drown in the sea. Catelyn's face turned pale with anger. She looked at Robb, voice trembling. How dare he? He dares call himself King of the North. Robb crushed the parchment in his fist. He's taken Deepwood Motte. That's Glover land. Balon is trying to cut off the west. If he holds the Motte, he can threaten any attempt to relieve the rest of the coastline. He exhaled, heart hammering. We'll not let him keep it. Catelyn's jaw tightened. Your father would say the same. What of Theon? Has he betrayed us too? Robb's mind reeled. I don't know. Perhaps he was powerless to stop his father. Or perhaps he joined him. Either way, Balon Greyjoy has chosen war. He drew a breath, fighting to keep his tone level. We must muster our strength. I'll lead a host west to retake the Motte and drive the Ironborn back into the sea. Catelyn nodded grimly. We should send riders to White Harbor and to Torrens Square. Rally every able-bodied man. Mage Mormont was already concerned about the Ironborn. She'll fight them fiercely now that they've truly invaded. Robb looked around the solar, trying to contain his white-hot anger. Another war so soon? He had just returned from the south. But the North would never submit to the Greyjoys. Not after the rebellion that had cost so many lives. Not after Theon had grown up at Winterfell under Ned's guardianship. It was an unspeakable betrayal. "Gather the lords," he said at last, his voice low. "We ride in a fortnight. Let the ravens fly to King Renly too. Let him know Balon Greyjoy claims kingship over the North. See if the crown will lend ships or men." Yet even as he spoke, he was certain the crown might offer only token support at best. Renly was newly enthroned, still consolidating power, and might see the Greyjoy threat as a Northman's problem. No, the North would have to fight this battle largely on its own. But fight it they would. The blood in Robb's veins flared with the memory of Ned Stark's unwavering stance in the face of defiance. The Greyjoy rebellion had been crushed before. Robb vowed it would be crushed again. Within days, Winterfell was abuzz with preparations for war. Carpenters hammered at wagons, blacksmiths shaped new spearheads. The courtyard filled with men practicing at Pells, their breath misting in the chill morning air. Lords who had left returned with levies. Lady Mormont arrived at Winterfell in person, bringing a small but fearsome band of Bear Island warriors, each woman wielding axes with grim determination. Lord Glover, hearing of Deepwood Mott's fall, arrived with a drawn face and sorrowful eyes. His seat taken, his family endangered. He pledged every man he had left. Rickard Karstark promised to lead 1,000 riders from Carhold. House Tallheart and House Serwyn contributed troops, as did many smaller clans from the mountains and the rocky coasts. They all recognized that this was no mere raid. It was an attempt by Balon Greyjoy to carve off pieces of the North. And that was intolerable. Robb took command swiftly. He planned to march from Winterfell to Torrhen Square, gather more forces, then swing northwest toward Deepwood Mott. From there, they would retake the fortress, drive out or destroy the Ironborn garrison, and secure the coastline. Maester Luwin's ravens flew tirelessly. Why, coordinating the moves. When some lords asked whether he would name himself king in the North again to better rally the men, Robb refused. "I've sworn my fealty to Renly," he said. "That vow stands. If the men need a name to rally to, let them rally to Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North." My father never called himself king, yet no one doubted his leadership. A hush fell after those words, and more than a few lords nodded with respect. Indeed, Eddard Stark's memory was enough to inspire loyalty. If the men required a figurehead, they had Robb. Crown or not, he was Ned Stark's son, and that was enough. Bran watched the flurry of preparations from his chair by the hearth, face troubled. "You're leaving again," he murmured when Robb paused to speak with him one evening. A single candle flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Robb knelt beside him. "I must. The Greyjoys attacked our land. I can't ignore it." Bran pursed his lips. "I know." He glanced at Hodder, who stood nearby, smiling absently at the candle's glow. Summer the direwolf lay curled at Bran's feet, ears twitching. "Let me come with you," Bran said suddenly. "I can't walk, but I can." Robb shook his head gently. "I need you here, Bran. You're my heir. If something happens to me, you're the Stark in Winterfell. I won't risk taking you into a battle zone. Not yet. We need a Stark presence here to maintain order. Mother will remain too, to guide you." Bran's eyes shone with tears of frustration, but he said nothing. Slowly he nodded. "I just want to help." "You are helping." Robb squeezed Bran's hand. "This is your seat as much as mine. If the realm needs a Stark in Winterfell, you'll be that Stark. I trust you, little brother." Bran swallowed, then mustered a shaky smile. "Then go. Make them regret ever setting foot on our shores." Robb rose, heart heavy. "I will." Catelyn tried to hide her worry as she supervised the provisions for the march. She had lost her husband, nearly lost her son. Now she faced the possibility of losing another child to war. But she was a Tully, raised to honor alliances and duty. She would not weaken Robb's resolve with pleas to stay. Instead, she gave him guidance on forging alliances among the mountain clans, reminding him of their value in any skirmish. She also pressed him to keep lines of communication open with King Renly's court, in case the crown decided to intervene. The day of departure arrived. A hush fell over Winterfell's courtyard in the early morning, the sky a pale wash of pink and blue. Soldiers lined up, banners lifting in a gentle breeze. The grey direwolf of House Stark, the bear of Mormont, the mailed fist of Glover, the sunburst of Karstark, and many lesser sigils. War horses stamped and whickered. Stout garrons awaited the mountainous roads. Men in boiled leather and chain mail checked their weapons. Women and children stood at the edges, bidding farewells. Some wept, though softly, not wanting to break the brittle hush. Robb swung into the saddle. Grey Wind, his dire wolf, trotted beside the horse, ears alert. The imposing beast had grown larger since the southern campaign, muscle rippling beneath a shaggy gray coat. More than one man looked at Grey Wind with a flicker of awe, believing the old tales that said the wolves of House Stark were omens of destiny. Robb raised his hand. "We march!" The horns blew a low note that resonated through the castle walls. The gates creaked open, and the column moved out, winding along the old road toward Torrhen Square. Robb led from the front, flanked by his trusted bannermen. The crisp morning air filled his lungs, fueling a determined purpose. War again, he thought bitterly. But if that was the price to keep the North safe, so be it. Days of marching followed. At Torrhen Square, they took in more men. Lord Tallheart had mustered 300 archers and foot, with an additional 50 horse. They brought disquieting reports. Ironborn longships had struck at smaller fishing villages on the coast, carrying off spoils. Robb clenched his jaw. Balon Greyjoy was systematically plundering the western shore, sowing fear and chaos. Their priority, though, remained Deepwood Motte, the seat from which the Ironborn could launch deeper incursions into the heart of the north. Beyond Torrhen Square, the terrain grew rougher, the forests denser. Autumn leaves carpeted the ground, muffling the tramp of boots. Eventually, the smell of salt began to lace the air as they neared the coast. Scouts returned with word that the Ironborn had fortified Deepwood Motte's walls. Many of the Glover folk had been slain or driven out. The castle ramparts bristled with iron men, some boasting that they were unstoppable on land or sea. Robb wasted no time. He set up a forward camp a few miles from the motte, safe among thick stands of pine. Lord Glover himself, his face etched with grief, guided Robb around the perimeter, describing the fortress's layout. "There's a palisade and a timber wall," Glover explained, voice trembling with anger. "We can breach it, but it'll cost us men. The Ironborn have archers along the walkway." Robb nodded. "We'll test their defenses, look for weaknesses. Then we storm the walls at dawn." He cast a glance at Grey Wind, who padded at his side. "They think a timber wall will stop the north? They've chosen the wrong land to conquer." That night, the men huddled around small fires, the wind blowing cold off the sea. The occasional gull cried, and the hush of waves carried through the trees. Robb walked among the troops, offering words of encouragement. He saw the fear in some faces, fresh recruits who had never tasted battle. Others, veterans of the war in the south, bore the stoic acceptance of men who'd seen enough blood. He paused by Miege Mormont's cluster, where the Bear Island warriors sharpened axes in silence. She rose to greet him, a curt nod. "We'll fight these sea rats as we've always done," she muttered. "Drive them into the surf." Lord Karstark checked in, arms folded. "The men are uneasy about facing the Ironborn in a fortress. We're used to meeting them on open field or in ships." He exhaled. "But we have the numbers. They can't hold long if we coordinate a proper assault." Robb laid a hand on the older lord's shoulder. "Agreed. Rest well, my lord. Tomorrow we end this farce." He himself lay awake in his tent. Grey Wind curled at his feet, teeth occasionally bared in a quiet snarl. Robb wondered if the direwolf sensed the tension. He couldn't help replaying old memories of Theon Greyjoy, his jokes, his brash laughter, the way he'd brag about the Iron Islands. Friend once. Could Theon be inside those walls? Or had Balon taken him elsewhere? Would Theon be forced to fight against the people who had been his family for a decade? The thought twisted Robb's gut. He had no illusions, though. If Theon stood against him, he would be treated as an enemy. That was the harsh truth of war. Dawn broke with a veil of fog creeping in from the sea. The pine trees shimmered with dew, and the world felt hushed, as if holding its breath. Robb rose, donned his mail and a fur-lined cloak. His sword hung at his side, newly reforged after the last campaign. He mounted his horse, gave the signal with one sharp hand gesture, and the host advanced silently through the mist. The plan was straightforward. Assault the main gate with a ram while flanking forces set fire to parts of the palisade, distracting the defenders. Archers would keep the ironborn on the walls busy. Once the gates broke, the mass of northern foot would surge inside. They approached the motte in pre-dawn gloom. The fortress's timber walls loomed, silhouettes in the dim light. Ironborn sentries spotted them and raised a clamor. Horns sounded within the fortress, and Robb heard frantic shouts in the harsh accent of the Iron Islands. The Northmen quickened their pace. With a roar, the ram team charged the gates, a massive log hewn from the forest, iron-tipped at both ends. Under covering shields, they slammed it into the gates. Thump, the wood shuddered but held. Thump again. Arrows rained down from the ramparts, clattering off shields. One Northman cried out and fell, an arrow protruding from his eye slit. Another took his place. Thump, the gate groaned, splintering slightly. On the walls, the ironborn poured oil down, trying to hamper the ram, but a cluster of Mormont warriors darted forward, axes raised. They hacked at the barricade that shielded the ramparts, screaming war cries that echoed off the timbers. Meanwhile, the flanking forces, led by Karstark men, ignited resin-soaked torches, hurling them at the palisade. Flames sputtered and caught, sending up clouds of black smoke. The Ironborn rushed to douse it, dividing their attention. Robb spurred his horse closer, bellowing encouragement to the ram team. Drive it home. One more blow. The men heaved in unison, ramming the gate with all their strength. The old timber gave way with a splintering crash, the gate's center snapping inward. Gray wind howled. The defenders above tried to shoot down into the breach, but the combined hail of northern arrows forced them to take cover. A heartbeat later, the Northmen rushed forward through the shattered gate. A fierce melee erupted inside the courtyard. Ironborn axemen met them, brandishing brutal weapons. The stink of smoke and sweat choked the air. Blood splashed the dirt. Men screamed. Robb dismounted, safer on foot amid the narrow space, and waded into the fight with sword in hand. Gray wind bounded ahead, leaping upon an ironborn soldier, fangs tearing the man's throat. There was no time to think, only to fight. He parried a blow from a tall, reeking raider who spat curses in the old language of the Isles. Robb felt the jolt of steel on steel. He shoved the man aside and slashed low, opening the raider's thigh. The man toppled, howling, and Robb moved on. Around him, the northern host poured in, overwhelming the defenders with superior numbers. Glover men, fueled by fury at the occupation of their lands, led a savage push toward the inner keep. Somewhere above, on the wooden ramparts, archers kept loosing arrows. The shrieks of the wounded mixed with the roar of flames where the palisade burned. The Ironborn did not yield easily. They fought with the ferocity of cornered beasts, but they were outnumbered nearly 3-1. As the courtyard filled with Northmen, the defenders fell back, retreating toward the keep. Robb followed the surge, stepping over bodies, hearing the clash of axes, the ring of swords. Lady Mormont herself, spattered with blood, led a wedge of Bear Island warriors that smashed through the keep's side door. Inside, the halls were dim and reeked of stale ale and unwashed bodies. They found pockets of Ironborn still resisting. Another savage fight erupted in the corridor, blades flashing. Robb pressed forward. "Yield!" he shouted at one Ironborn man who was cornered, an arrow sticking from his shoulder. The man spat at him, then lunged. Robb blocked his sword with the shriek of steel, then slammed the pommel into the man's face, knocking him out. Shouts came from deeper in the keep. "They're fleeing! They're fleeing!" Indeed, some of the ironborn were trying to slip out the postern gate into the woods, but Karstark men waited there, cutting off escape. The ring of battle drew to a crescendo, then began to die down as the last pockets of resistance were snuffed out. Thick smoke from the burning rampart drifted overhead, stinging eyes. Glover men hurried to extinguish any flames that threatened the keep itself. Bodies littered the ground. When at last the fighting ceased, Robb found himself in the main courtyard, breathing hard, flecks of blood on his cloak. Gray wind panted beside him. He turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning for any more threats. The battered remains of the ironborn who tried to hold the motte lay strewn about or knelt with weapons cast aside, begging for mercy. Glover men roamed, cheering as they reclaimed their ancestral seat. One of them hoisted the House Glover banner, raising it atop the ramparts as the Kraken flags were torn down. The battle for Deepwood Motte was over. Robb exhaled a shaky breath. He walked among the captives, scanning their faces for Theon Greyjoy. He did not see him. These men wore the sigils of lesser ironborn captains, Saltcliffe, Drum, and a few bearing no sigil at all. One captive, wounded and pale, glared up at him. "Theon Greyjoy isn't here," he spat. "This was my command." Robb stared at the man. "Balon gave you the motte?" "Aye." The man coughed wetly, blood staining his lips. "The prince, Theon, was not to be trusted. Balon commanded me to hold this castle for the Iron Islands." The man offered no more words, collapsing from his wounds a moment later. Robb stood there, sword in hand, chest tight. So Theon was not present, and the fortress had indeed been seized directly under Balon's orders. Robb felt a flicker of relief that he would not have to face Theon on this bloody field, but the question of Theon's loyalties hung over him like a storm cloud. He began issuing orders. Search the keep, aid the wounded, gather the prisoners. Let the Glover men reclaim their home. The bitterness of betrayal stung fiercely, but at least the seat was retaken. Now to see how widespread the ironborn occupation was. Glover approached, battered but triumphant. "My lord, we found some of my household locked in the cellars. We owe you everything. Deepwood Motte is ours again." Robb clasped his shoulder. "The North stands together. We'll keep standing until every last ironborn is gone." Glover nodded fervently. "We'll see them drowned in their own seas." In the following days, Robb learned that the ironborn still held a chain of coastal villages. Other captains had landed further down the shore. Their strategy seemed to be to seize enough territory to establish a foothold and then force a negotiation. With Deepwood Motte liberated, however, the Northmen could coordinate a counterattack. Lord Karstark urged immediate pursuit. Lady Mormont wanted to strike Bear Island next, to ensure no ironborn ships dared land there again. Glover pressed for a thorough purge of his lands. Robb tried to keep it orderly, dispatching separate forces to drive out each pocket of raiders. Piece by piece, they would reclaim every inch of the North's coastline. One crisp afternoon, a rider galloped into Deepwood Motte's courtyard, wearing the sigil of House Tallheart. Panting, he handed Robb a sealed parchment. Robb read it under the watchful stares of his bannermen. Then he looked up, eyes narrowed. "The Ironborn have attacked Torrens Square," he said grimly. "Lord Tallheart is besieged. Worse news yet." Other riders confirmed Balon's forces had landed in multiple spots across the neck. The war was blossoming into a larger conflict. Robb clenched his jaw. So be it. They would chase Balon Greyjoy from these shores or bury his raiders in northern soil. He did what Ned Stark would have done. He took to the field. Leaving a garrison at Deepwood Motte under Lord Glover to secure the region, Robb assembled a swift force of cavalry and marched south again, aiming to relieve Torrens Square. The roads were thick with refugees, small folk fleeing ironborn raiders. Robb's outriders captured stragglers wearing the Kraken sigil, extracting what information they could about enemy troop positions. Each day brought new skirmishes, ambushes in the woods, glimpses of longships hugging the coastline. It began to feel like the entire western coast was aflame. Yet the Northmen had momentum. They outnumbered the ironborn, who were far from their home seas, spread thin, reliant on quick raids for advantage. The old saying rang true. The ironborn were deadly at sea, but on land, their advantage faded, especially against a unified north. Over weeks of grueling marches and hard-fought skirmishes, Robb's forces recaptured each holdfast. Torrhen Square was relieved after a fierce battle outside the walls. The ironborn routed and chased back to their ships by wave after wave of northern infantry. Robb himself led the final charge that broke the raiders' lines, gray wind snarling at his side. Lord Tallheart thanked him with tears in his eyes, and yet Balon Greyjoy himself never materialized on the battlefield. He remained somewhere at sea, presumably aboard his flagship, orchestrating the campaign from a distance. As the northern knights advanced, pockets of ironborn withdrew, re-embarking onto their ships when the tide allowed. The rearguard battles were savage, but eventually the coastline was nearly cleared of their presence. Robb could sense victory within his grasp. The ironborn had inflicted damage. Burned villages, stolen goods, terrorized the small folk, but they hadn't gained a true foothold. Now they clung only to scattered outposts. One last large band was said to be fortifying itself near the shore of the Fever River, preparing to hold out or possibly wait for reinforcements from Pike. Robb resolved to finish them off. In the late autumn twilight, Robb's war council gathered in a makeshift pavilion pitched on the banks of the Fever River. The wind smelled of brine, and waves lapped a stony shore a short distance away. Meej Mormont, Rickard Karstark, Lord Tallheart, and a handful of other captains crowded around a rough map pinned with small wooden markers. By torchlight, Robb pointed to a bend in the river where the ironborn were rumored to have set up a palisade. "We strike at dawn. Lord Karstark, take the left flank with your horse. Lady Mormont, your men will attack from the wood line on the right. I'll lead the center with Tallheart. We force them into the river. Make sure they can't retreat to their ships." Faces around the table wore expressions of grim determination. The ironborn raids had angered every house here, and none wanted to show mercy. A few hours after finalizing the plan, the leaders dispersed to ready their men for the next day's assault. Robb lingered by the torch, staring at the map. This war felt more personal than the southern campaign. The land he defended was truly his home. The men and women who suffered were his direct responsibility. He thought again of Theon, remembering a boy who used to joke about the might of the Iron Islands. Now that might had come to ravage them, but the Ironborn had miscalculated the North's resolve. Morning came cold and rainy, a dull drizzle that made the ground slick and the air heavy with the smell of wet leaves. Robb's host formed ranks, each section prepared to converge on the Ironborn camp. The wind rustled the edges of the tents, carrying the hiss of the Fever River's current. A scout reported that the Ironborn had built up earthworks along the riverbank, but their position was not strongly defensible. Robb set his jaw. This would end today. They advanced through a line of scraggly pines, boots squelching in mud. The drizzle turned to a heavier rain, pattering on helmets. Gray wind patted ahead, hackles raised. Soon, they spied the ironborn fortifications, a crude fence of sharpened stakes, behind which men scurried to prepare. Cries rang out as the watchers noticed the approaching army. Horns bleated, and the ironborn rushed to man the barricade. Moments later, the northern horns answered, echoing through the drenched trees. Karstark's horse charged from the left, hooves churning mud as they thundered toward the fence. The ironborn braced spears, but a barrage of arrows from Tallheart's bowmen cut down many before the cavalry struck. Timbers cracked under the force of galloping horses. The fence swayed. On the right, Lady Mormont's warriors hurled axes, hooking to stakes and tearing them aside. Robb led the center in a direct frontal push, forging through the break in the fence. The ironborn fought viciously, cursing and slashing in the downpour. Blood mixed with rainwater, turning the dirt into a red mire. Robb pressed forward, sword flashing. He parried a blow, then drove his blade through an ironborn captain's mail. Another came at him from the side, but gray wind barreled into the attacker, snarling. The stench of damp fur and iron tang hung in the air. Thunder rumbled overhead, and lightning flickered, illuminating the carnage for an instant of ghostly clarity. Gradually, the ironborn line buckled. Karstark's riders cut off their avenue of retreat, while Mormont's infantry pressed from the flank. Some ironborn tried to flee into the Fever River, only to be pulled under by the swift current or pinned by arrows. Others dropped weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Few survived unscathed. Robb held his ground, chest heaving, water running down his face. He saw the last cluster of ironborn battered into submission, their weapons kicked away by furious Northmen. The entire camp was overrun. One figure among the captives drew Robb's attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a distinctive helm shaped like a kraken. He was spitting curses at the Northmen who held him at spear point. Robb pushed through the throng. "Who is this man?" he demanded over the hiss of rainfall. A Glover soldier replied. "He calls himself Aaron Blacktide, a captain loyal to King Balon. He led this band." Robb stared at the man. "Yield," he commanded. "Your men are beaten. There's no sense in further bloodshed." Aaron sneered, blood on his lip. "You think you've won, Stark? Balon Greyjoy will keep coming. The sea is vast, and our ships are worthless on land." Robb cut in coldly. "You've accomplished nothing but slaughter and ruin for yourselves." He glanced at the mass of bodies. "Take him and the rest who yield prisoner. We'll see if they're worth ransoming." Aaron spat again, but offered no more struggle as the Northmen bound him. Others tossed down the last of their swords, their faces sullen. Robb's men looked to him for direction. The question of what to do with so many ironborn captives loomed. Some would be ransomed. Others might be executed if they were known to have committed atrocities. Robb had no appetite for pointless cruelty, but neither would he let the ironborn walk free to raid again. By midday, the rain slackened. Robb rode along the bank, surveying the devastation. Bodies were stacked in piles, waiting for pyres or burials. The damp air stank of death. He felt no triumph, only a dull relief that the conflict seemed nearly done. The Northmen had reclaimed or secured every major stronghold that Balon's men had taken. Casualties had mounted, but not as high as they might have. The cost in small folk lives, though, weighed heavily on Robb's conscience. A shape moved at the water's edge, and Robb recognized Lady Meage Mormont. She stood near the shallows, staring out to where the Fever River joined the open sea. A hush lingered around her, broken only by the distant cries of wounded men. Robb guided his horse closer. "My lady," he said softly. She turned, face spattered with mud and soot, her expression grim. "They came for Bear Island too, or they would have. We owe you thanks for forging an alliance strong enough to fight them off." Robb slid from his saddle, wincing at the ache in his muscles. He joined her at the shore. "We're all the North. We stand or fall together." She gave him a sidelong glance. "I remember we named you king once, boy, but I see you don't need that crown to defend us." A small nod of respect. Perhaps that's all that matters. Robb felt his chest tighten. He bowed his head. Perhaps. They gazed toward the horizon, where the faint outlines of ironborn ships might linger, waiting for a chance to strike. Yet for now, it seemed the North had hurled them back. The gulls cried overhead, swirling on the wind, as if mocking the ironborn's claims of rule over the waves. In the days that followed, word spread that Balon Greyjoy had withdrawn most of his ships to Pike, frustrated by the North's unexpectedly unified response. Some longships still raided lonely coves, but the large-scale invasion was done. The Ironborn had gained nothing but a heightened enmity from the entire region. Among the prisoners was a small handful of lesser captains, none of them Theon Greyjoy. Rumors abounded that Balon kept Theon at his side, possibly as a token or as a scapegoat. No one knew for sure. Robb established a line of watchtowers along the coast, ordering that any future ironborn landings be repelled at once. He wrote to Renly, informing him that Balon Greyjoy had declared himself a king. Renly's reply was surprisingly brief. He acknowledged the situation but offered only general condolences. The crown was entangled in southern matters, reconstruction efforts, and the continuing captivity of Stannis Baratheon. Robb did not press further. The North could handle its own defense. Gradually, the battered northern host returned inland, some men going back to their homes, others escorting prisoners to Winterfell or White Harbor. The worst of the threat was contained, unless Balon launched another grand effort. Robb doubted it. The old Kraken had tested northern waters and found them too dangerous. If Theon had hoped to placate his father, he had failed. If he had hoped to remain loyal to the Starks, that hope was likewise crushed. When Robb finally rode back through Winterfell's gates, a subdued crowd greeted him. The war with the Ironborn had lasted only a few months, but the toll was heavy. Catelyn met him in the courtyard, embracing him fiercely. "You've won again," she whispered, voice trembling with relief. He kissed her cheek. "Yes, but I grow weary of these victories, mother. Each one costs more than I can bear." Bran was waiting by the ramp leading to the Great Keep, perched in his basket on Hodder's back. The direwolves hovered protectively, Summer for Bran, Shaggy Dog for Rickon, who lingered at his brother's side. Rickon's eyes lit up when he saw Robb, but he didn't rush forward, as if the boy sensed how tired Robb was. Instead, Rickon just offered a small, solemn smile. Bran's voice was soft but steady. "Welcome home, again." Robb nodded wearily, meeting his little brother's gaze. "Thank you. Is all well here?" Bran shrugged. "As well as it can be. The harvest is nearly in. We had no trouble. The nights grow colder." Robb glanced up at the looming sky, thick with autumn clouds. Winter is coming, he thought with a pang. That old Stark motto took on new urgency. War with Lannisters, war with Greyjoys, now overshadowed by rumors of horrors beyond the wall. He stepped closer to Bran, resting a hand on the back of Hodder's shirt. "I'm glad you're safe. We lost good men, but the Ironborn are driven out. The North stands." Bran gave a small nod. "It always does." They made their way inside, where a warm fire awaited. Maester Luwin approached with a flurry of parchments. "My lord, messages from the Crown, from the Night's Watch, from White Harbor." Robb held up a hand. "I'll see them in an hour. Let me at least wash the battlefield from me." His voice sounded hollow. Luwin dipped his head in compliance. In his chambers, Robb peeled off his muddy cloak, slinging it over a chair. A weary bitterness consumed him. In so short a time, he'd fought 2 wars, one in the south, one in his own land. He had surrendered a crown for peace, only to find more bloodshed on his doorstep. Had he done the right thing, or was the realm always destined for conflict, no matter the alliances? Catelyn came in quietly, seating herself on the edge of a bench near the hearth. "What weighs on you?" she asked gently. He sighed, rolling his aching shoulders. "Everything. Balon Greyjoy's betrayal, Theon's silence, the future threats beyond the wall. Even if we find peace now, there are the rumors of White Walkers. The Night's Watch begs for help. How many wars must we fight?" She rose, stepping close enough to place a hand over his. "You have done more than many men twice your age could manage. You united the North, ended the war in the South, and repelled the Ironborn. Your father would be proud." Robb shut his eyes, letting the warmth of her hand soothe him. "Still, it feels like I stand at the edge of a chasm, mother, with no idea what might come next." She cupped his cheek. "Then we face it as we have faced everything together. The North has faced darkness before. It will again." He opened his eyes, gazing into hers. In that moment, he found a small measure of solace. They were Starks of Winterfell, bound by blood and the old gods. If the storms gathered again, they would stand firm, as their ancestors had for thousands of years. Nodding slowly, he turned his gaze to the window. Outside, Winterfell's courtyard glistened with recent rain. The sky overhead was a tumult of clouds, shot through with the last rays of a sinking sun. Against the gloom, the towers of the castle stood tall. He remembered a day not so long ago when he had been a boy, throwing snowballs at Theon, laughing with his brothers. That world was gone. A new one had taken its place, shaped by sacrifice and uneasy alliances. Yet, amid the sorrow there was hope. The North was battered, but it endured, and Ned Stark's memory was no longer stained by the Lannisters' lies. The realm was at least spared from the worst of the southern power struggles. For now, he allowed himself a deep breath. Tomorrow he would call the banners again, not for war but for rebuilding. He would see to it that supplies were sent north to the Wall, that houses ravaged by ironborn raids received aid, that families of fallen soldiers were cared for. If new threats arose, he would meet them as Warden of the North. If the crown called upon him to fulfill fealty, he would do so carefully, ensuring that the North's interests were safeguarded. And someday he might see Theon again, whether as friend or foe only time would tell. For now he had done all he could. The war had ended in the south, and the Greyjoy incursion had been repelled. Peace, though fragile, settled over the north. Robb thought again of his father's words, echoing from long ago. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. They had survived as a pack. Let the rest of the realm shift and roil with ambition. The North would stand, guided by the memory of Ned Stark and the loyalty of its people. He gently squeezed his mother's hand, then turned away from the window. Another day's challenges awaited, but the cold walls of Winterfell welcomed him with a steady, unchanging hush, as though reminding him that some things, honor, family, duty, were eternal. If war found him again, so be it. He would face it with the stoic grace of the North and the unbreakable bond of his house. And in that knowledge, at least for this fleeting moment, Robb Stark found a measure of peace.